We have a very rich lineup this morning. My name is Dr. John Buschman. I am Dean of University Libraries. That's my permanent job here. But for the purposes of this, I'm Interim Associate Provost for Research and Innovation. So I am co-hosting this morning's and co-moderating this morning's program, along with Dr. Michael LaFountaine, who's a professor in the Department of Physical Therapy, and for our purposes here, he is the director of the Office of Grants and Research Services. We have a rich program, literally going from Anderson to Syria, A to T, not quite A to Z, covering a variety of topics. Everything from glass cliffs in education, the physics of time, the soul in the ends of Abraham, peptides in antimicrobial synergy, diversity in a Catholic view of diversity, and Twitter and religion among those. That's a sampling of about half of what's coming. I will briefly introduce each faculty member very briefly, and then we will get to the presentations very quickly. And each speaker will have 15 minutes or less, I'm hoping, and I will signal them with 3 minutes left and then introduce the next speaker. So with that, I want to introduce our first speaker of the day, Dr. Justin Anderson. He is an associate professor, I believe to be promoted very soon in the School of Theology. He studies moral theology at the seminary and holds his PhD from the Catholic University of Louvain. He is going to speak on diversity, a Catholic view, and I welcome Justin.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking this time. I'm going to share my screen, a little bit of a presentation here. Hopefully you can all see that. So the part of this work for me moved out of my research from last summer, which is now accepted as a peer-reviewed journal article to be coming out in Logos, a Catholic journal, out of Minneapolis-St. Paul area. The basic premise, I think it's best to say is, and this goes with a lot of how I approach ethical terms or terms that we find in our society in general, or at least in our way of expressing, particularly ethics, how we think of good or evil, right or wrong. I oftentimes I take the approach of that we don't always have as rooted a sense of a term, and that different people in our pluralistic liberal societies, largely in the West is what I'm thinking, at least, use these terms with different understandings. And so oftentimes our conflicts arise in ethics or the political realm or in society or culturally come from a sort of slamming together of different meanings. So that's kind of just the general approach that I oftentimes find myself taking in previous work. And so with much of the attention that is given, and rightly so, to diversity, equity, and inclusion, in my own readings, I started to run across these terms of diversity. And I found that interesting because my own readings were from the 13th century. And so I thought, well, what did they mean? What did a scholar who weighs heavy in the Catholic intellectual tradition, one scholar, I call this a Catholic view, not the Catholic view, but one scholar from Thomas Aquinas, what does he mean by diversity and how does this compare or contrast? How can this inform a Catholic institution like our own in an age where we have sort of these different meanings underneath the same name? So I'll just give you the core of Thomas's approach, and I don't do everything that I do in the article, but I'll gesture to the rest that I do when I come to the end. I open by simply sort of posing this this modern question that we oftentimes hear, that is, why should I be open to, or why should I celebrate diversity? And this isn't necessarily an antagonistic question. It might just be someone who's curious, what's the reason behind the reason that we're celebrating diversity? And I think when you look at modern accounts, and I sort of gesture to this, in the literature that I've seen, and this is sometimes in educational theories or business theories, it actually derives from some kind of utilitarian notion that, well, it'll be better for me if I do. And I just find that that's maybe a little bit less satisfying than what it could be, that maybe we could be a little bit more altruistic than sort of saying, I'll get something out of this if I'm sort of open to other people being on my team. The other modern notions are usually claims of justice, but justice, like diversity, gets understood in different ways, so that becomes difficult to advance on that way. So I return to the question of Thomas, which was slightly different than our modern question. Our modern question is, why should I be open to and celebrate diversity? And Thomas Aquinas, when I say Thomas, I mean Thomas Aquinas of the 13th century, died 1274. He simply asked, why is there diversity at all? And he asked that about really creation, what he took to be simply the natural world. And he argued against different understandings of diversity that had been put forward either at his time or in previous ages. And what he basically rejects is an account that says there's a diversity in the world because it's a purely naturalistic cause. It's sort of this mechanistic function of nature. It just sort of showed up this way. So he sort of rejects this. And along with that, he rejects any kind of unintentional cause. And of course, he's driving at something here. So just hold on a second, you'll see. And then he rejects an early church father, Christian father called Origen, who says, well, God created one thing, and then there was sin, and sin introduced all this different diversity. So the reason we have diversity is because of evil. Well, he rejects that. He says, no, no, no. So the conclusion he arrives at, his preliminary conclusion, and I have a little quote here from my article, not from Thomas, is that Thomas rejects these theses, these three theses and explanations of why there's diversity in the world, because he's moving against any theory that ascribes diversity in the world to a source arising outside of the benevolent, the loving intention of the Creator. In other words, a diverse creation is planned, intended, and wanted by the Creator. That's his fundamental jumping off point. And this is what I think is certainly a central thesis to any Christian view of diversity. So why is there a diversity then? That's what he rejects. So what reasons does he give? And he thinks that there exists a diversity in creation because that diversity is willed by the Creator. How does he reason to this? Well, this is what Thomas sort of comes to. And in 5 steps, this is his logic. And this is pretty much my presentation, these 5 steps. So number 1, God created all things so that his goodness may be shared with creatures and represented by them. So fairly sort of basic sort of Christian account of creation, why there is anything. It's willed by God. Number 2, if creation is supposed to sort of manifest the divine goodness, then God's infinite goodness cannot be adequately manifested by a single creature alone, right? So you have a finite creature trying to manifest an infinite goodness. And Thomas thinks, well, of course, this is problematic. You're never going to get a finite creature that can completely manifest in the different ways of God's infinite goodness. And so what follows from that? God created many and diverse creatures that what was lacking in divine representation in one could be supplied by the other. So this is where you have this sort of benevolent, purposeful creation of why there's diversity at all in the world for Thomas. And so it follows that the whole universe together shares in the divine goodness more perfectly and better represents it as a diverse set of created elements. And then finally, Thomas goes on to say, just to make sure that we don't think all of the world sort of exhausts God's infinite goodness, it still does not. So even the entire created universe does not adequately express God's goodness. And that's something I return to at the end of the paper, and I'll just sort of gesture to that briefly. So Aquinas summarizes his thoughts then that the multiplicity and distinction existing among things, this is Thomas, were devised by the divine intellect and were carried out in the real order so that the divine goodness might be mirrored by created things in variety, and that different things might participate in divine goodness in a varying degree. And so the very order existing among diverse things issues in a certain beauty, which should call to mind the divine wisdom. So Thomas also sees this notion of beauty that's present when we see diversity, and beauty that can turn us not just to the beauty of creation itself, but ultimately to the praise of the Creator. So he has a few different things, and then I'll end. First off, he thinks that this account is intelligible, that there is a reason for diversity. It's not only a cause, but there's actually a purpose and a reason that we can discern in the diversity. Things have their intelligibility because there's a creator. So on a Catholic view, it becomes quite impossible actually to celebrate diversity, I think, at least on Thomas's view, without the idea that there's a creator. So God remains necessarily a part of this, this understanding of diversity. It's sort of intrinsic to it. And then finally, diversity is authentic only to the extent it reflects the intelligible order of the Creator. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, simply because something exists doesn't mean that it's completely good. Clearly, we live, as Thomas would say, in a fallen world. We see crime, we see this. We don't say, well, let's celebrate the diversity of crime, right? So in some way, we have to take account of the things that exist that are not good or fall short of the goodness they're intended to. So that's hence that sort of order. And we need to pay attention, and that the diversity rests on an understanding of wholeness, integritas, that sense of integrity is what, right? And I always tell my students an integer is a whole number by definition. That's what the word actually means. So this sort of integrity that we speak of today is a sense of wholeness that is reflective of harmony and beauty. And so that's really all I want to share from my presentation. I'll keep it short and sweet. I would just say my article goes on to talk, this is just the beginning. My article goes on to talk about what about cultural or racial diversity? How do we understand that on this basic account? And there's a lot that has to be unpacked. For Aquinas, he's talking about why are there gnats, angels, and tulips? Like, why are there diverse things? And of course, when you're talking about, diverse cultures and diverse sort of, as people sort of say, the races, although we have to put that in scare quotes depending on how we mean by that, but diverse peoples, let's say, then we're obviously talking about the same thing, the same sort of being, right? A human person. And so there's a greater unity in that, even though there is a diversity. So you get a little bit of unity, diversity always have to stick together when we talk about this as a Catholic, on a Catholic approach. The second thing I do is talk about, well, what about diverse acts? I sort of mentioned this when we talk about, diversity of crimes, like we don't want to celebrate that. So how do we make sense of that? And then I return to that final point at the end. Thomas says that no created sum of things can ever exhaust the infinite goodness. And for him, this is the point of Jesus Christ, that he is the perfect image of the Father is one of the things that St. Paul writes. Jesus says in John 14, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Philip talking to one of his disciples. So for the Christian, Christ becomes that perfect, that really inexhaustible divine goodness. And there's a special place for Christ sort of as an uncreated imaging of the Father. So a very Christological sense. But I hope this is an account that is open to not just a Catholic view, but a Christian view. And insofar as sort of the Abrahamic religions could look at God as diverse, they probably, obviously they wouldn't hold, our Jewish brothers, our Muslim brothers and sisters wouldn't hold to that last part on Christ sort of being the perfect image of the Father. But I hope that they could still see a way forward here to celebrate diversity as part of the intentional and benevolent plan of a creator. So that's basically where my research went. Happy to share it. And thanks for listening. A bit like drinking from a fire hydrant. Sorry.
Thank you, Justin. And I am applying 40 lashes with a wet noodle to myself because I should have given a shout out to Norma Rubio, who organized all of you into this panel. Knowing faculty at Seton Hall, I know that that can't have been easy. So with that, great start. Thank you, Justin. We're going to turn, we're slightly ahead of schedule. We're going to turn to Ruth Surya, who does work on digital religion. And let me pull this up. She is an assistant professor of communication in College of Communication and the Arts. Does work, as I noted, in digital religion and has her PhD from Texas A&M University. She is going to speak today on should you follow God on Twitter and other modern problems. So take it away, Ruth.
Thank you, John. And actually, thank you, Justin. That was a great start. And I have like a million follow-up questions, but I'll try to stay focused on my presentation and maybe we can chat later. So again, thank you for that introduction. When I was given this invitation by Norma, I was really trying to think about, what can I say about this research that is not just looking at a specific project that I'm working on, but giving people an overview of what do we even mean by digital religion. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to do today. I'll give you a little bit of an overview, and I focused at 3, maybe 4 if we have time, specific projects to give you a view or a taste, let's say, of what I do when I study digital religion. So when you hear this phrase, digital religion, I'm sure various thoughts come to your mind, right? The classical one that I like to think about is, the Pope on Twitter, or if you're on Twitter, maybe you even follow God on Twitter, which is an actual account that you can look and follow. So scholars of digital religion did not start in the pandemic. That wasn't the first time that we thought, oh, maybe we should look at, what's happening with this internet and religion. Scholarship on what we call digital religion has been going on for about 25 years or so. So really from the beginnings of, let's call it, public internet. And I'll get back to that public part in a minute. And so in that scholarship, much like in the scholarship of religion, if you're familiar with, or the scholarship of digital media, some of the questions that we deal with are definitional, right? What is religion? What is digital media? So again, we wrestle with defining that combination between the two. And one of the definitions that myself and Dr. Heidi Campbell come up with in our latest book is we think of digital religion as a concept that sort of bridges and asks questions about digital technology and culture and how they shape each other. So if you read this definition that I have here on the slides, it says how digital technology and culture shapes religious practices and beliefs, but also how religion seeks to culture new media contexts and establish ways of being and convictions about the nature of reality and the larger world, meaning how they inform each other. So we ask questions like, how is religious practice being transferred or transformed online? And I'll give a few examples in a minute. How do religious individuals leverage digital media? How do they use it? Do they use it differently than non-religious individuals? How are religious institutions or globalized cultures responding to or being impacted by internet development? And something that might be especially interesting for those of you who are in positions of religious leadership is how do religious authorities, are religious authorities undermined due to religious practice online, which we know is highly participatory. So in the study of digital religion, we kind of went through what we like to think of as 4 stages. And this again ties very nicely with Justin's talk, because that last stage that we're in right now looks at what we call the contextual, but in thinking of diversity and very much in the way that it was referred to in the previous talk. So the first wave of digital religious studies was very much a descriptive stage. This is, kind of like the beginnings of the internet, right? And everybody's like, oh my God, what is this thing? So much of the scholarship that you find published on would probably be called new media and religion at that stage. We're talking about like maybe very late 90s, early 2000s. Mostly just describes, hey, there's this community that's using, blogs or chat to go through religious experiences together. So you'll find a lot of not just descriptive, but also almost like utopian or dystopian discussions at that stage too. Papers that say something like, oh, all religion is going to be online, or papers that say something like, this new technology is going to destroy religion as we know it. So some texts in that area is Give Me That Online Religion by Basher, and etc. I'm not going to bore you with the whole bibliography. But then we move into the next stage, which is the categorical, and now we're in the mid-2000s. And here, scholars are starting to see this is not just a passing thing, this internet phenomena. And so what are the different uses of digital religion? And we start to come up with a few themes that are pretty consistent in the study of digital religion. Questions about authority, like I mentioned before. Questions about community. Questions about identity, ritual, and embodiment. So these are some of the themes that we start to see being woven through different studies. And that leads us into the next stage where digital religion starts to come up with some theories of this sub-emerging field, which I'll talk about those theories in a minute. And then lastly, in the stage that we are in now is the contextual, where we are, again, going back to that concept of diversity, we're seeing how digital media is so pervasive, is such a deep part of our life that we need to understand the context of each digital religion phenomena. So here you'll see also a diverse, much more diverse studies. So we're not only looking at, American Christianity, for example, we're finding more studies about, for example, Hinduism online or Christianity in Korea, right? So we're starting to see more complexities in the ways that digital religion is conceptualized and described. And of course, these waves are not mutually exclusive, right? Any one study from, I don't know, last year probably has a little bit of all of these four areas. So if you're still not kind of convinced that digital religion is a thing, here's a few examples of digital media and religion, right? So of course we have our Pope tweeting, but we also have things like churches in the metaverse, meditation and podcasts, new religions that are coming up and expressing themselves online. For example, the religion of copyism, that basically says something like the ability to share information digitally is the new imperative, is the new religious practice of the 21st century. So there's plenty of more examples, and I won't go in depth because I want to share a little bit of the main theories or the theories that are especially interesting for me in my study. So one of the things that I argue are the most pervasive or most important when we think about digital media in comparison to previous media is the fact that digital media has what I call the power of everybody, right? When we read Thomas Aquinas, when we read even a text like the Talmud that is very collaborative, these texts were written by holy leaders, right? These texts were written by men and women, mostly men, that were skilled and, kind of put their lives around creating these texts. Some of these texts also become holy texts. And then, more traditionally, religious inspiration comes from these sources, right? So if I want to understand a concept in Christianity or a law in Islam, I open these holy texts or I ask my religious leader. But online, while we have access to these things, you can ask the rabbi online or you can read the Quran online. We also find more and more the power of everybody. So for example, one of my studies looks at how when people ask a question to the rabbi online, they also get comments and shares and likes from everybody else. And I argue that that interaction, that participatory part of digital media makes that part of religion online actually much more powerful. That power then works not just through a leader, but through mutual peer regulation. And that is a very powerful aspect of digital media that is different from previous media. Of course, we always had social norms, but most of the times those norms were not written. So this world of the internet where social norms are written and communicated in these ways is where things start to get a little bit different. I'll just briefly mention two other things, and I'll put the links later if you want to look into it. So my mentor, Heidi Campbell, also argues that we're looking at a new phenomena in terms of networked religion. And to put this argument pretty quickly, the idea is that while in the past people belonged to a religious community because it was their community, the community was the focus. Today, people understand themselves as network selves. And this is an argument from digital media studies more generally. So, but what Campbell argues is that this is also true when people seek religion and religious interactions online, so that people seek religion with a focus on the self, and then they can belong to various religious communities at the same time and kind of mix and match and seek what they need online. So they might be following the Pope without being Catholic because they're getting inspiration from them. Or maybe on Twitter, they're following both the Pope and the Dalai Lama. And those things are not necessarily in contradiction for them. So spirituality, understanding the self, those are the things that motivate religious individuals in the 21st century. And then lastly, and very briefly, one of my latest papers is on how these religious concepts also make us understand digital media differently. So I argue that we basically think of the media itself, our cell phones, as a sacred object. And I go into detail thinking about how we think of coders as prophets or priests, and how we think of the cloud as this, kind of like magical space, or the internet as something that happens that holds a lot of, awe for us. But at the same time, these digital media are also very profane, right? We use them to, I don't know, play Candy Crush or bank. And that interaction between the sacred and profane in our digital media is very interesting for the 21st century because, as I argue in the paper, it is exactly that profanity that makes digital media sacred. And if you want to hear more about that argument, I'll let you read the paper. So I have a lot more to share, but I don't want to take too much time. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to share more. You can contact me via email or Teams or Twitter or whatever you want.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Ruth. Norma must have really put the fear of Yahweh into everybody because you are adhering to the time limits, and I very much appreciate that. So we've had two presentations in the area of religion. Now we're going to take a turn to Dr. Fanali Jia, who is going to present on transmission of parental norms in children's pro-environmental behavior in intergenerational contexts. Dr. Jia is in the Department of Psychology. He is an assistant professor transitioning to tenure. Congratulations. And he is a cultural and developmental psychologist, obviously interested in cultural differences that he's going to, has done prior work on, and he is going to present on. He holds a PhD from Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and we turn next to Dr. Jia.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Let me share the screen first. All right. Okay. Is it the screen you're seeing? Because I can't see that.
Yes,
the PowerPoint.
we
All
can
right.
see
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, this is the Peter Shine. Yes. Well, finally, I know other folks doing a wonderful research. I'm teaching core 2 classes, so I think the first, the diversity in religion and additional in religion is an interesting topic for students to discuss. So it'd be interesting to bring that to perspective to my class to talk. Right. So turn my presentation. Right, and I will go with like an overview as well. So now talk about specific paper, but talk about the project have been done for the past few years, and then the things I'm doing now about like environmental worldview. Right. So first of all, what is the environmental worldview? Right, this is a really abstract concept, and it's not clear defined in the literature. So this is what I did in my class, and then also I present some of the part to a younger child as well, right? And what I ask the student question is like, just how many of you can name a 10 different of kind of brand, right? Like Louis Vuitton, Nike, Adidas, right? So like student raise their hands quickly, right? So then I ask, how many of you can name 10 different video games, right? So like student raise their hands very quickly. They can like even tell me the game. Right, and then I ask, how many of you can name 10 different kind of trees? Right, then the classroom becomes silent. Right, so student may say Christmas tree, peach tree, apple tree. So that now count. Right, so what that mean is it does not mean that more trees you become more environmental, right? But just one aspect about that environmental worldview is how you affiliate with the nature. So what does the nature mean to you? It means like where you grow up, how you grow up. Is that nature as part of your identity when you grow, right? So that's one part of the environmental worldview. So it's been defined as environmental affiliation with nature or self-identity. Right, so another part of the environmental worldview is how we believe about environment, right? We believe the environment, like animal, human has equal right. We believe climate change, so they call environmental belief. And ultimately lead to a pro-environmental behaviors, is how we act, how we engage about to help our environment. So this is kind of my past research. I look at the definition about environmental worldview, and then how that 3 aspects play a role. And then also I look at individual factors as a psychologist, look at identities, future generational concerns, moralities, and all of them related to this environmental worldviews. And then the environmental worldview also relate to psychological well-being. So this is a rich literature as we talk about. Right, and then currently I'm working on the questions of how parents teach or transmit it or convey that value or worldview to their child, right, through action, communication, engagement, and through a knowledge part. And then also I find that as the larger context, the society, the city level of grain or GPA, right? So GDA also play a role on those factors as well. Right, so I have to give a lot of credit to my doctoral advisor, Dr. Michael Pratt. So he started longitudinal data, means like we follow up each individual multiple years. So he started follow up those individual at their age 16. And then we finished the longitudinal data at age 32. So I joined the lab when we collect the data as the latest wave when participants age 32. So at that age 32, so I give environmental questionnaires, right, and then give environmental interview. So some of the study cited here also include his one of his recent books on this emerging adult identity issues. Right. So for that project, right, so I give environmental the new ecological paradigm scale, means like to look at environmental belief. I also have environmental identity scales to look at if nature is part of themselves, and also have environmental inventory involvement, see how individuals engage about in the environment, more like the frequency they did recycling or doing environmental behavior. Right, and then I also give an interview. So I interview about 100 participants, just ask them to think about general environmental scenes important to them, talk about a specific event. They saw some people harm the environment, but they have the moral courage to stop. And vice versa, they saw some people harm the environment, but they feel coward. They didn't have the action to stop them. Talk about turning point stories, how these scenes turn them into environmental or non-environmentally, right? Teaching stories and then the future stories. So not all of those environment narrative has been analyzed. So in terms of methodology, so I did quantify the qualitative interview. So I have the meaning making code, means how the events connect to them. Vividness means the detail, and then the impact, so how the story impact them individually. Also, there's other code like the pro-socialities, emotion, which haven't looked at it yet. Right, so in terms of the narrative, so I also have the qualitative examples. So there are many of them, so I use thematic analyses to look at common themes. So two themes I want to highlight here, which kind of lead or transition to the next project. Right, so a lot of the people, participants who are age 32 back at the time, right, so talk about two things. So one thing, they talk about having a children as the focus for crystallized environmentalism. Means that they have a child, and then now you can look at the last part. So they want to do something to ensure that things are incredibly messed up for their next generation. So it means like they want to leave something for the future. One thing is the clean earth. And also another group of participants talk about this family traditions. So they want to have something when they grow up with as a kid. So they have this backyard and then they grow things, they look at bird, and they want to pass that tradition to their future generation. So two things which lead to the question recently I'm investigating is who should be the primary social agent to teach young children about this environmental worldview? Right, and then also I got this idea from my own son, right? So one day we bought a toy, so we opened the box, and then my wife said, please throw the box to the garbage can. And my son back at the time was 4 years old, and suddenly said, this is not garbage, this is recycle. So 4 years old understand recycle garbage, right? And my wife said, where did you learn that? And then my son said, I learned from my dad. So I feel proud. Right, so the answer should be simple, should be family, school, society, right? So there should be no much debate. Right, and then I looked at literature. So there, surprisingly, not many study has focused on these three aspects together. A lot of study focus on parent-child, on academic achievement, emotional closeness, right, on variety other factors, pro-sociality, but not on the environmental worldview. Right, so this a few paper has been published recently, and then a few things is under review on exactly the questions of how parents, norms, family, society, school transmit value to the next generation. Right, so I started this from my visiting scholar, visit Seton Hall a couple years ago before the pandemic, right? And Dr. Yu, so she collected data in China, so all of the data set from China. So we started from interview, just basically ask the parents, so tell me what about like the event or activity you did with your child, right, about the environment. So we come up with like a huge list, so we narrowed down. So we narrowed down to 18 environmental activities from the interview. And then we test that 18 activities using a large sample of respondents, including mother, father, grandparents, others. Right, and then we could a couple example items like repair toys and walk, play in nature environment, discuss the importance of environmental actions. Right, and then we're using a statistical validation, so exploratory effect analysis and confirmatory effect analysis, measurement and variance to test that 18 items to see that if those 18 items play an equal role across those respondents, mother, father, grandparents, on the primary caregiver. We also have a more diverse samples from north, south of the place, and then family income. So finally, we end up with the 7 items. So the second part is I also interested in how that 7 items, the engagement play a role about caregiver child diets. So we keep collecting data. We have this about 518 diets, so parent, grandparents, and then their child. Right, and then kind of diverse, 5 different cities about young child, 1st grade to 6th grade, diverse family income. And then look at specifically the questions of how or if parents' environmental behavior directly transmitted to children's environmental behavior, right? And I do find a link, but that direct link is kind of unstable. It means that not all behavior can be easily transmitted, right? So for example, reusing paper cannot be directly transmitted. Saving energy cannot be directly transmitted. So I look at an indirect path, means what else can help that strengthen the link. So one thing is how children perceive or observe parents' actions, how parent-child communicate, discuss on the issues, and the most importantly is how parents engage. So I name it like how parents aid children on environmental behavior. So action, communication, and engagement. And another thing I look at is how this environmental knowledge, right? So we keep collecting data and then give this environmental literacy scale. So some of the questions are relatively easy, like most of oxygen in the atmosphere came from plants, right? And then some of them are kind of like difficult for this 10 years old child or children. Animals today are most likely to become extinct because, right, we see the answer. So there's a frequency of the answer they chose. So people are swinging between B and D. They are unable to reproduce because pollution or the habitat where they live is destroyed, right? The answer is D. And we also look at where they got those information from. So we look at most of them say from TV, books, parents, internet, school, or magazines, or a few from friends, right? To look at the source of information. And because of time, I can present that also the source of information depending on where they were from rural side, north, south, urban, from high or low socioeconomic status. All right, so there's a couple more studies. I don't have time to present about this environmental worldview, so happy to share. Right, and then also the data is just rich. We also have ask children to write environmental essay about this being environmental protectors. Right, and then we also have a reverse look at how children teach their parents on environmental worldview. Right, so in the end, this is my lab, and in my department, we have a student club on environmental club. So we look at this environmental psychology issues in local and international. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jia. Thank you.
Thank you.
We turn now to physical and mental health screenings in U.S. school districts. Dr. Beth Jameson is our next presenter. Beth does work in, obviously, research in nursing. She's an assistant professor in the college, epidemiology, community and population health, and she brings a particular focus on the role of the school nurse to her research. We are, and again, I want to emphasize, I'm grateful that we are running a little bit ahead of schedule. I appreciate people adhering to that. Take it away, Beth.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Buschman, for that introduction. So what I'm going to present here today is research that myself and a colleague at Hunter College in New York City had done together to look at a publicly available data set from the Centers for Disease Control that gives us some information related to school health policies and practices in our public schools in the United States. And unfortunately, because of COVID, we don't have any data sets that are earlier than 2018 and later than 2018 or 2019 to look at mental health. So this is a pre-COVID snapshot of what's happening in our public schools and looking at what we do and how we serve with school health services and school nursing services our children who have chronic health conditions. So really what I want our listeners and people who are listening in today to understand is that school health nursing is more than just what many of us consider to be the individual who hands out Band-Aids and ice packs. School health services and school nurses do a great deal of other things related to taking care of the health of children. And because many of us didn't have like a chronic illness or a severe injury or something that impacted our ability to learn, we didn't really have a lot of interactions with school nurses, and therefore mainly the general public doesn't believe that there's a value to having school nursing and school health services in the United States. So I'd like you to leave with the idea about the impact that school nurses can make on our public health and community and population health. So let's talk about what kinds of things are happening in our schools with children who have chronic health conditions. So chronic health conditions are things like food allergies, obesity even falls in that category now, hypertension, asthma, diabetes, seizure disorders. And about 25% of the children that are in our US schools do have one or more chronic health condition. Myself and Dr. McCabe had done some previous research on policies within the United States on chronic health conditions, and we discovered that having a policy was much lower in the western areas of the country. So in general, we do know within the United States that across the other side of the Mississippi, if you will, the western areas of the United States in general don't even have school nurses within their school buildings. We're very fortunate here in the Northeast corridor of the United States that most of us, if we lived in this area, came from a school where we had a school nurse in our building. And in the United States, in the western area of the country, we have children who don't have school nurses at all. So you can imagine what that can mean for a child who, say, for example, is a newly diagnosed type 1 diabetic, who is 8 years old and now needs to administer insulin for the rest of their lives. And who is going to help that child in school, give them their shots, help them count their carbs and so forth. And if there's no school nurse in the building, that often falls on either perhaps the superintendent or the principal's secretary, or the parents need to come in and take care of that. So I just wanted to briefly show you just a snapshot of what we have for school nurse coverage in the United States. And this is from the National Association of School Nurses websites. If you wanted to know more about school nursing, you can go there and get more information that drills down more specifically, even by state and counties in the United States as well. This is the theoretical framework that also guides not only nursing, but also our educational realm, because we are working school health services within something that's primarily devoted to education, which is in itself can create a problem as well when we're thinking about where are we going to put our dollars when our school budgets are devoted mainly to education services. And if our school is in an area where we're being targeted because we're underperforming, where am I going to put my dollars? Am I going to put it to school health services, or am I going to put it to buying new textbooks and enhancing my curriculum with teachers who are specially trained in certain services? And many school districts do have to make those kinds of choices. So what we decided to do in this study was to focus just on the state of California and look at their policies related to chronic health services within their schools in that state. We chose California because it was the largest state in the western area of the country, and we'd already looked at what was happening across the US in an earlier research paper, so we wanted to see if there was differences about having a policy or not, and whether or not they provided chronic health disease services for children. As I said before, we used the school health policies and procedures profiles survey. There were 504 public secondary schools that were sampled. The CDC does a weighted sampling practice, and you can read more about that online. Also, I have the references at the end. We use complex sampling models to inform us with our data because this was what we call a big data set. We looked at questions that were in the policies and practices survey that were about chronic health management, family and community engagement, and whether or not there was employment of a registered nurse, either full or part-time. The people who responded to this survey were our school principals. So that was a limitation, especially when you use big data or secondary data sets, is that you're limited by what was captured by the survey itself. And if we could have a do-over on this, I would have preferred that school nurse or somebody who is more knowledgeable about school health services would have answered, because generally school principals are devoted to focusing on education and don't really know all about what's happening with school health and school nursing. So our results found that in the state of California, just about 86%, 87% of our schools did employ a school nurse, and 13% did not, which was surprising. That was actually a nice finding, to tell you the truth. Here's what we found when we looked at the provision of services, however. So we were looking at daily medication, whether or not they stocked rescue medications. So that would be, if some of you are familiar with somebody having an anaphylactic allergy, such as like peanut allergies. They usually have to carry what's called an EpiPen, which has epinephrine within it to help reverse the consequences of developing a severe allergic reaction. Would mean generally that you stop breathing and can die if you don't get that medication. Case management means that there's conversation between the primary care provider or the specialist within the school health service provider, which is hopefully the nurse. We're linking parents and families to health services and programs within the community. That's especially important with many of our underserved and under-resourced families, and also providing disease-specific education to the parents and the families of those students, so that moving forward, these children are ultimately going to become adults. So who is teaching that child, if they have a long-term chronic disease, to be able to start developing those tools and learning opportunities to be able to manage their long-term disease as they move forward and become adults? One of the things that became very unsettling for us is, if you look at the data here, that we've got schools, now 80.3% of the schools said that they provide daily medication administration for students. So this would be like asthma, insulin, ADD medications, for example. But 68% of those schools that said that they have a policy. So remember that this isn't just about how many have a school nurse or do not, but if they have a policy, because we were looking at policies and policy implementation. 68% of the schools that said that they had a policy to provide daily medication for students in school don't have a full or part-time school nurse in their building. So I want you to consider right now, who do you think is giving that medication, and what does that mean for that particular child? For many of our children, especially our underserved, under-resourced areas, it might mean that the child is missing a lot of school and creating absenteeism, because if the child has, let's say, asthma, and for those of you who have asthma or have children with asthma, usually seasonal allergies also can be huge triggers for children with asthma. They'll need to use their inhalers more frequently and might need a nebulizer treatment. And unfortunately, what may occur here is the child stays home from school where they could get asthma or the asthma nebulizer or get their inhaler at school with the help of a school nurse, but instead it's probably not happening. So that was where we were looking to understand more about, will school nurses and having a policy about having a school nurse make a difference? So yes, indeed, we did find that that's exactly what happens, is that if there's a policy, you're more likely to have a school nurse in the building. If there's not a policy, then you may or may not, but you're more likely to have a school nurse, which is what we were hoping that we would see. But we also wanted to understand that in the context of chronic health conditions, and we found that it's definitely important to have a school nurse. In the last dot point here on this discussion page, here about the intent to provide positively for health services. That's how California has a statute that is supposed to be considered a policy. But it doesn't really say that all schools need to have one, or how many, or what ratio to student to school nurse and so forth. And a lot of our states have something similar or nothing at all to say that they would prefer that there is a school nurse providing health services in their schools. So in conclusion, we did discover that it is indeed important to have a school nurse and someone who can provide health services that encompasses not only chronic health conditions, but screenings and protocols, and they need to be provided by a medical professional. We know that the lack of school nurses is not a new problem. There's all kinds of things that lead us to not have school nurses in our buildings, them related to wages. You can make so much more money working in acute care and hospital settings than you can as a school nurse, and the level of responsibilities that people have. Many school nurses have responsibility, let's say one school nurse for like 2,000 students in a high school. How can you possibly screen all those students and let alone take care of the injuries and acute care things that might come in the door during that school day? We also need some policies to change in terms of funding sources, because we do believe that from the past research that because funding is primarily a local school budget and developed and people can vote on that locally in the community, that if we took the funding and maybe had better sources of funding that came directly from the federal government to go directly to health services, that would definitely help with the provision of school nurses in our buildings. And the other component that happens here, and those of you who do policy research understand this very acutely, policies and policy implementation, it doesn't mean just because you have a policy that is implemented, and if it is implemented, is it implemented with fidelity? And here are my references, and if you're interested to know more information about what I'm doing in school health and school health services, that is my passion. You can contact me here. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. I neglected to mention Beth's PhD in nursing is from Rutgers. So thank you, Beth.
Thank you.
We turn now to Dr. Jennifer Itzkowitz, who is, pardon me, who is in the Department of Finance in the Stillman School of Business. Dr. Itzkowitz's PhD is in finance from the University of Florida. She studies contemporary problems in corporate finance, banking, and behavioral finance. So with that, her topic is going to be on bias in app-based investing tools. Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Give me a minute to just share my screen here. Okay, great. Can someone just confirm that you're seeing my screen?
We are seeing your screen.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So thank you for this great opportunity to present my research. It is joint work. I'm going to present one paper that's joint work with Jessie Itzkowitz and my colleague Andy Schwartz, who's also a finance professor here at Seton Hall. So before I begin with our specific research, I wanted to talk about the difference between traditional finance and behavioral finance. And what I'll be presenting today falls squarely in the realm of behavioral finance. So traditional finance grows out of the School of Economics, and the School of Economics tries to maximize our utility subject to certain constraints to make a prediction about what we should do, what we ought to do. And it makes the assumption that humans are rational, that we have the ability to analyze every aspect of every decision. But it turns out that we're people and we're irrational and we have limited capacity. So behavioral finance looks at what we actually do. And so, for example, we know that we should exercise to stay healthy. But if you take a look at that picture on the right-hand side, take a minute and ask yourself what you notice. You might ask yourself, like, do I exercise enough? And what I see is people taking an escalator to get to the gym. Like, they know they should be exercising, but we sometimes make these quick default decisions. The escalator is here, I'll just get on it. Now, with regard to finance, the life cycle theory of finance, a very rational theory, says we should save money during our working years, and we should invest it in the stock market so that we can put our money to work for us. And then we'll have money when it's time to retire, then it's time to withdraw and spend that money. But what has confounded economists and finance academics is that people don't save enough, and when they do save money, they don't put it to work for them. They don't invest it well enough. And so for some reason, people are really surprised by that. Finance academics have spent a lot of time questioning why that's the case, and they've come up with a lot of answers. One of the answers that they've come up with is that there are barriers to entering the stock market. So, investing money in the stock market, some places require that you invest a minimum amount, which is too large for people. Sometimes it's just hard and it takes time, and we see that people are very inertial. So when I think about my father trying to invest money in the stock market, not only did he have to have a very large initial amount, but he had to actually pick up the telephone and call his stockbroker, which took time and energy. And so these are some of the barriers that people encounter when it's time to invest properly. So I have great news. There are a lot of apps which have helped people to solve some of these problems. So this is a photograph from the wall of the subway at Union Square, not too far from where I live in the city. And what I noticed that there's been this explosion of app-based investing, and this is great. So just to name a couple of different apps that allow you to easily get started investing your money, saving and investing your money. We all know about Robinhood. Stash is a very popular startup. There's also, in case you're not aware of them, Stockpile, Betterment, Public, Webull, SoFi, Greenlight, just to name a few of these new app-based stock brokerages and startups that help you save money. So these are great. For just so long, academics have bemoaned this problem that people haven't saved enough, they haven't invested it well enough. And so good news, app-based startups have encouraged millions of people to begin investing. It's great because you can start with a really small amount of money. It eliminates a lot of the traditional barriers. It's very easy to get on. And so what you see here in this advertisement is that you can start with just $5. Right? That's all it takes. You don't have to wait until you have a big pool of money. The bad thing is we do have these behavioral biases that we're not perfectly rational and we don't have infinite processing capacity. And so we fall prey to like these quick decision-making criteria, and one of them is anchoring. And anchoring bias prevents people from accruing the full benefits. So I was on my way to school one day and I saw this ad on the subway, and what I noticed was that Stash is encouraging people to start with just $5, but then what they have is this person has magically made it to an investment account with $5,000, with $10,000 as their next benchmark. And I started to wonder, is that really possible? So that's what I'm going to take a look at in this research. Are apps really the panacea that we hope they are? And I want to go back to some original literature. There's this idea of anchoring. And anchoring occurs when early exposure to a particular number non-consciously influences subsequent choices. So what that means is that you see a number and your brain stores it. And then because we don't have this infinite processing capacity, we accidentally use this number in future decision-making processes. So the original experiment done by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman is they asked subjects, generally college students, to walk into a room and spin a wheel with numbers on it, and they weighted the scale. They weighted the dial so that it almost always landed on either 10 or 60. And then after they asked people, what do you think the percentage of African nations in the United Nations is? And they come up with this very surprising result that if they spun the wheel and it landed on 10, then people were much more likely, the average answer was 25%. People were much more likely to choose a smaller number. But if the wheel landed on 60, then people would choose a much larger number. On average, people chose that 45% of African nations in the UN were in the UN. And so this is kind of a, this is not a real life experiment, but what it shows is that the number we spin on the wheel, it gets lodged in our memory, and then we use it, and it influences subsequent decisions. So here's how we use that. Stash recommends that you start with just $5. Now, we think that this creates that non-conscious anchor, and that future purchases will be based on that first purchase. So our first hypothesis in this research is that investors will anchor on the first purchase amount they make. Our second hypothesis is that anchoring will then influence wealth accumulation because you anchor on the first amount and then you continue to make purchases or contributions to your account in smaller and smaller amounts. And so you just don't grow your wealth quite the way you should over time. So while apps are great in that they get people to start investing, they don't get people the full way there. So we feel very privileged that we're able to acquire a proprietary data set from an app-based stock brokerage. And the brokerage gives us anonymous information about all of their users. We know the user's age, gender, zip code. We know all of their stock purchases and sales. We know what stock they purchased on what date. We know how they funded it, if it's a contribution to their account or if they purchased it from money in their account. And this stock brokerage also has two really unique features that really help our research. The first is that you can buy fractional shares. So if you want to buy a stock, there's many stocks right now that are trading in the hundreds of dollars or even thousands of dollars. You don't have to buy an entire stock. You can buy just a small amount of it. So you can buy, for example, $5 worth of Amazon. And the app allows you to make your purchase in dollar amounts, not even percentages, and then it just calculates the percentage of the stock for you. The next thing about this data that's very cool, I think, is that you can give the gift of stock. So you can give a stock gift card for $25. Congratulations, college graduate. Here is $25 worth of Starbucks stock. And so it's a really good way to encourage people to start investing young. So here's our first piece of evidence supporting our hypothesis. What this graph shows you is the subsequent purchase amount relative to the first purchase amount. So the number 1 means your subsequent purchase is for the exact same amount as your initial purchase. And the number that I want you to take away from this is that 19% of subsequent purchases are for the exact same value as the first purchase amount. Now that's huge because you can invest any amount, you can buy a stock at its full price, you have the ability to type in any number, and there's just so many subsequent stock purchases at the exact same value and right in a narrow band around that initial amount. So this is our first piece of evidence that anchoring is happening. And then we have all kinds of additional evidence in support of our anchoring hypothesis. We divide the data up into the type of purchase. So we look at self-funded purchases. Now, it's completely rational to choose an amount that you want to invest based on your income and your spending habits, and then make the rational decision that I am going to repeat this purchase amount over time. So instead, we look at accounts that were opened based on gift cards. Now, gift cards are given by a third party. My aunt has no idea what my income and spending habits are, but if she gives me a gift card, it's unrelated to these factors. It's from someone else. And so these really represent no information, but they do create an unconscious anchor. And that's really what we see. And we use all kinds of both univariate analysis and multivariate analysis that allows us to control for all kinds of other factors. And we still find very strong evidence of anchoring. Now, another thing that we do is we look only at the second purchase that someone makes. And so what we see here is that even when we only allow one observation per person, we see evidence of anchoring. And what this tells me is that it's not like one person rationally repeating the same purchase amount every time they get a paycheck. Instead, all people are anchoring. We have some related hypotheses. We expect that the memory of an anchor should fade. And we see that this happens. As you make more and more trades, the likelihood that your 30th trade is at the exact anchor value, it fades, it dissipates over time. And the same thing is true about the amount of time between stock trades. We question whether all people anchor, and we find that they do. We're able to break up the sample by self-reported gender and by age categories, and we find that anchoring is consistent across all types of people. Now, why does this matter? So people anchor. Sometimes these behavioral biases are benign, and sometimes they're even helpful, right? It's good to take a mental shortcut if it helps you get to a quick decision. But what we find is actually, that this is a problem. that people will accumulate significantly less wealth if they start small. So if your first purchase is for only $5 and you are more likely to continue to make $5 purchases over time, then you will not accumulate nearly as much money as a person who starts with $100 and then their next purchase is also for $100. And so what we find is that the initial purchase amount influences wealth accumulation. And what you see in this table, across the x-axis at the bottom, I have what people's first purchase amount was. And the blue bars tell you what their average subsequent purchase amount was. So you can see that, and these are all median values, what you can see is that if a person made a $25 purchase as their first purchase, they're most likely to make a $25 purchase as their second purchase. And then the gray line shows us how much money people accumulate in their investment account after 1 year. What's their account balance after 1 year? And if you look at the axes on the right-hand side, what you see is that someone who makes a first purchase of $25 ends up accumulating around $70 in their account. But someone who starts with $200 as a first purchase continues to invest in large dollar amounts and accumulates just over $500 in their account. So this is really significant. Anchoring causes people who start with small amounts to continue to invest small amounts and accumulate a very small amount of wealth over time. So we have several conclusions from this research. The first is we believe we show evidence that when people anchor, that people anchor on their initial stock purchase amount, whether they have chosen it themselves, or especially when they get a gift card, which is purchased by someone else. And as a result, it influences the value of their subsequent stock purchases. We find that the memory of the anchor does fade over time, but it never fully goes away. We find that all types of people anchor. And we find, most importantly, that this anchoring behavior influences long-term wealth outcomes. And so while these new apps have really allowed more people to begin investing, we need to be really careful to make sure that we're helping people invest in the best possible way, in a way that's optimal for their situation. And we believe this research has implications beyond just app-based investing. It has implications for all types of retirement and savings accounts, 529s. There's several state and municipalities right now that encourage low-income families to start investing in these very small micro accounts for special types of college savings for their children, and they agree to match the account. But these accounts start with, on average, just $50. And so if you ask someone to make an annual contribution of just $50 to their child's college account, we just don't think that it gets them nearly far enough. And so we need to come up with advice for investors that sets a low enough amount of money that encourages them to invest, but sets a high enough amount of money that they should be investing at their optimal, to encourage them to invest at their optimal amount. So we need to explore ways to nudge investors towards decisions that maximize their own interests. And so that concludes my research presentation. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present. And I just want to say I've really thoroughly enjoyed all of the other research presentations that I've seen as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. Very interesting. Honestly, it's kind of counterintuitive to me. You would have thought the incentive would have been to keep upping your game on that.
It should be, but ask yourself how long you've been at the university and how many times you've changed your contribution to your 401k plan.
Next.
Exactly. I have received some raises over time since I've been here, and it turns out even as a finance professor, I know I should contribute more, and I haven't contributed.
Very sporadically, I do it. You're right. You should do it every year. Thank you. All right. From investing, we go to peptides. Greg, how do you pronounce your last name? Weidman or Weidman?
It's the German way, Weidman.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Professor Gregory Weidman is our next speaker. He is going to talk on flippase blocking peptides In the rest, I'm not going to read.
Okay.
Greg is an assistant professor in chemistry and biochem. He obviously does work in the area he's going to talk to us about. His where are your degrees? There we go. PhD in material science from Johns Hopkins and postdoctoral work at Rutgers. Take it away, Greg.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Buschman, for the introduction, and thank you all for the opportunity to be here. I'll share my screen here. I'll bring up my presentation. And it's really nice that I get a chance to discuss this work because it really did sort of blossom from a University Research Council grant that I was fortunate enough to get when I started here, or the year after I started here at Seton Hall. So my topic and my work has to do with fungi. I'm very interested in, well, fungi for a number of reasons, but one particular reason that I find interesting, or maybe some of you might find concerning, is that unlike bacteria, where there are dozens of different classes of antibiotics that one could potentially use, fungi only really have three main classes of molecules that you could use to treat a fungal infection. Those are the polyenes, like amphotericin B, the echinocandins, the newest class, like caspofungin, and these azoles, such as fluconazole. So these are our three main types of weapons that we can use to combat fungi, such as this. This little one here is Cryptococcus neoformans. This is actually a picture from one of my undergraduate students, Osei Lindsay, who had a grant from NASA working on this particular fungi, trying to hit them with plasmas, which is maybe another story I can tell in the future, but we had some interest in looking at that. And this tends to be somewhat of a tricky fungi to deal with because it is resistant to one of the main classes of drugs, the echinocandins here. So of the three options that you have to treat a fungal infection of Cryptococcus, you are limited with these two classes, which have some of their own issues that may make them non-ideal for treatment as well. So this led me to the University Research Council grant that I was working on since 2019, which had to do with exploring flip bases as a target for potential antifungal applications and even potentially applications outside of that. This work was, while this is partly mentioned in a review paper that we published, my students and I published in 2020, we looked at these various different mechanisms that people have been concerned about that cause antimicrobial resistance. And one of the methods, or one of the ways in which we think has been understudied, let's say, is the role of this enzyme here that's called a flip base. So a flip base is the molecule that moves lipids and also other types of lipid-based molecules, lipid polysaccharides, things like that, from the inside of your cell to the outside of your cell. So what's interesting about that is the outer portion of your cell membrane, or the cell membrane of, let's say, Cryptococcus neoformans, is what the outside environment is going to be exposed to. So if we have, let's say, a drug that is going to interact with the microbe, with Cryptococcus neoformans, it's going to need to be able to interact with that cell membrane. And if you can change that composition, or if you can turn off an enzyme that changes it, lock it in place, you could potentially make it a little bit more susceptible to antifungal drugs. So that was the idea. Create a molecule that can interact with the flip base to kind of shut down its function. In this case, this particular flip base we'll be talking about moves negatively charged lipids called phosphatidylserine from the outside surface to the inside surface. So that was the goal: shut down moving phosphatidylserine and then potentially making the cell membrane surface more negatively charged and more susceptible to antimicrobial drugs. So this particular molecule here, if you were to take a look at it and think about, well, where are there potential nice targets for, let's say, antimicrobial drugs, the flippase itself has a few very small regions on the outside, and then it has this accessory protein called CDC50, which interacts with it in some way. And we'll look at a related type of CDC50 flippase molecule in our own red blood cells. We'll look at that in a second. But this is a large loop here. And the thought was, well, this loop, we know from some experiments that we'll see a little later on, we know that it has to interact with the flippase in some way. So wouldn't it be interesting, or would it be possible to maybe take a portion of this loop and turn it into a molecule that could interact with this flippase and then get stuck? Basically gum up the works, as you would say. So we took two of those proteins originally, and the reasoning for this, you can actually look into it a little bit more. So this is a QR code for the paper. It's an open access paper, so if anyone was interested, you could snap this and take a look at it. My student Rob published this paper. He was the first author on it, which is very nice. So these were the two peptides that we started working with first, this AS15 and QY15. And we wanted to take these peptides and look at, can they inhibit the growth of these fungi, the Cryptococcus neoformans? So this was our first attempt at doing this. So we looked at the activity of our peptides against C. neoformans, and we saw that, well, there's not a huge amount of activity. The activity maybe goes somewhere above 128 micrograms per mil. So just for reference, when you talk to, and I'm sure some of the clinicians that are here today with us can confirm this, when you talk to people who are clinicians who are interested in pharmaceutical development, drug development, they'll say, you really want to be less than 1 milligram per mil, and ideally you'd want to be much less than 2 orders of magnitude less than that. So you'd really want to get to maybe the 10 or so microgram per mil range or lower if you had something that you wanted to use as an antimicrobial. So we saw that, well, the original peptides weren't incredibly great, but if we added a lipid tail to it, if we added a little bit of a carbon chain tail to it, we did start to see some activity against a mutant type of Cryptococcus neoformans, which was actually deficient in that CDC50. So if you delete that protein from a mutant here, it actually becomes a little bit more susceptible to some of these peptides. So we thought, okay, that tail seems to be necessary for activity. And also, if we take one of those conocandin drugs and we mix it together with these peptides, we start to see what we call drug synergy, which is that the effect of adding both drugs together was better than the effect of adding only one drug at a time. So we thought, all right, let's take a look at this tail and let's see what happens if we make it slightly larger or if we shrink it. And as it turns out, what my student Rob found is that if you shrink the tail, that synergistic or additive activity goes away. But as long as you have a tail that is 14 carbons long, you see some additive synergy. You see some activity with caspofungin. So this is our first thought that, all right, this molecule has some sort of specific structure where it can interact with the cells in some way. We're not entirely sure if it's interacting with our protein that we're really interested in, but it's not just any random molecule that can interact. It has to have this particular length tail that's important, and we'll come back to that in a second. So what we wanted to do is try to make our molecule as small as possible. One way to get underneath that microgram per mil is to, well, decrease the size of your molecule, make it smaller, make it less massive, so you could use less of the molecule to treat someone with potentially this as a drug. So we looked at various different parts where we could chop up our sequence, our original AS9 sequence, and we found that if we did that, so if we chopped up our protein to make it AW9, which we'll see on the next slide here, we actually got a inhibitory concentration, an MIC value, a minimum inhibitory concentration. So a concentration of the drug at which we stopped the growth of the fungi of 4 micrograms per mil, which was actually equal to, and that is with the original fungi, not the mutant. If we looked at the more drug susceptible mutant, that actually has the same value as the drug susceptible mutant. So we've taken something and we've created that same effect in the what we would call wild type strain, so the naturally existing fungi. We created the same effect that we saw in a mutant strain that was artificially made weaker. So we replicated this effect with this particular peptide. So we'll take a look at these sequences here, and I'll see if I can ask someone in the audience here, if you could take a look at these sequences, and these letters represent a particular amino acid. So if you notice these sequences here, what letter appears more times here and then less times in the other sequences? If I could ask someone. Dr. Buschman, maybe if you're here, if I could ask you, what particular amino acid do you think looks interesting? Which letter is prominent in this one but missing in the other two, or has less in the other two?
The more prominent one is GG.
So there are G's. There's the same, or roughly the same amount of G's in both.
Okay.
What we noticed is, but thank you so much for the answer though. But what we noticed is more prominent in this one is that we kept both of these Ks. So these Ks are lysines. They're positively charged amino acids. We specifically created a peptide where we had either both of them, one of them, or none of them. And what we found, well, actually, sorry, I have a quick slide here before we get back to that. But what we also found is that our peptides are minimally hemolytic, so they don't burst red blood cells, which obviously that's something you would like if you're trying to inject it into someone's bloodstream. So they are, it's too early to say if they're safe without having done animal studies, but they are potentially not as toxic as, let's say, some other proteins. And if you notice, even the one that is as high hemolytic content as we saw, it was similar to the echinocandin drug anyway. So the original drug that people are using or trying to use has a similar hemolytic activity. So we'll keep that in mind, that thought about the different number of Ks in each of these sequences here. So we did some work with collaborators at Rutgers who were taking our peptides and were throwing it at cells. They had a particular type of Cryptococcus neoformans that expressed that flip-base molecule with a fluorescently labeled tag on it called M-cherry. And then we created a peptide for them that also had a fluorescent label. And what they noticed is that if they took their cells that were glowing red, the proteins were glowing red, and they added the peptide, nominally we saw that the image or the signal from the peptide here and the signal from the protein were in the same spot. So they were all located on the cell membrane. So essentially, the peptide wasn't just getting inside of the cell and attacking random parts of the cell. It seems like it's on the outside of the cell where the protein, the CDC50 protein, is located. Recall I said that the protein, what it does, our flip base here, is it moves the negatively charged lipids from the outside to the inside of the cell. So if it does that, you wouldn't see as much negative charge on the surface. So what we did is we looked at, so these are two populations here. These are blue are regular cells, so not treated with anything, and red are our cells treated with our peptide. So our AS AW9MA peptide. And what we're looking at on our axes here is on our y-axis is a measure of propitium iodide intensity. So propitium iodide, PI, is a small molecule that normally doesn't get through the cell membrane. But if you were to, let's say, kill a cell, if it were to die, the cell portions of the membrane would open up and propitium iodide would leak in and you would see a signal. So you expect on the y-axis, if you see more signal, it's more cells that are dying. On the x-axis, we have annexin 5, which is a molecule that will bind to negative charges on the surface. So if you were to see increased signal in annexin 5, it means that you see increased charge on the surface. In other words, increased phosphatidylserine on the surface because your enzyme has been shut down. And what we notice is that if we add that particular peptide, we see an increase in the annexin 5 signal and maybe a slight increase in our PI signal, but not that much more than our just cells that are normally in our normal cells, our wild type cells that aren't treated with anything. So that gives us the first indication, or that gave us the first indication that maybe our peptide is actually interfering with our P4 ATPase, our flipase here. So to go back to what Dr. Buschman was helping me describe earlier, this concept of changing these molecules. So now I've sort of looked at the lysines more directly. We synthesized peptides where instead of having lysines in those positions, they had alanine, a non-charged amino acid. So we changed lysine to alanine. And what we saw is that with a change of the 5th lysine to alanine, we decreased that annexin 5 signal. So there was less phosphatidylserine going inside or remaining on the surface. But if we mutated the 6th one, it was, or both of them, it was fairly similar to our baseline signal, to what we saw before. So our lysine mutants were somehow impacting surface phosphatidylserine. So this is a really cool video that one of my students made, and hopefully this will work. So this was part of Rob's dissertation. We don't have a structure, a crystal structure, to show us what's actually happening here, at least not yet. We tried to use something called AlphaFold, which maybe people are familiar with, but didn't quite get it to work. Despite that, though, we were able to find a structure in the literature that was from a red blood cell. So these are structures that are from a red blood cell. This is a similar type of flipase molecule and a similar type of CDC50. And what Rob was able to do was to look through this sequence and try to identify which portions of this molecule, this purple part here, or this magenta part here, are roughly equal to the portions that we used to make our peptides. So what are the analogous structures in this magenta portion here that represent the portions of our protein in our peptides? So he was able to do that. He was able to isolate those portions. So these are the similar amino acids in our proteins. He then also thought, all right, can I identify the portions that are as close to our CDC50 as possible here? What interactions are occurring there that allow this molecule to interact? And when he went through and he looked at the different types of interactions, he saw some various different hydrogen bonds. And as it turns out, some of the closest hydrogen bonds, wouldn't you know it, happen to be hydrogen bonds involving a lysine here. So similar molecule, not exactly the same, but a similar molecule to what we saw with our peptides. Even more interesting. So remember back to our initial structure-activity relationship assay, where we were looking at the links of the peptide tails. What you might wonder, and what Rob sort of, I think, very brilliantly wondered is, all right, I've identified the closest connection between this part here, our so-called peptide region, and our protein here. And if you notice, he's got a phosphatidylserine here as well in this structure. So this is a binding pocket where the phosphatidylserine could go. What's the distance between the closest spot on this peptide and the closest spot in this hypothetical binding pocket? Well, as it turns out, wouldn't you know it, it just so happens to be 14 angstroms, which just so happens to be the same length as our 14 carbon tail that he needed to add to it in order to have this peptide work. So again, this is a little bit, I'll admit, this is a little bit of circumstantial evidence. We don't have our exact protein, our exact peptide interacting with our exact protein. That's something that we hope to work with our collaborators at Rutgers who have a very fancy cryo-EM. We're hoping that they can help us figure that out. But it gives us an idea that maybe these specific structures, that tail and that lysine, or those lysines, maybe those specific structures are giving us actually a specific interaction here that we could exploit as maybe a new class or a new type of antifungal drug. So we're thinking about how can we use these molecules. Rob's been moving forward now and looking at, all right, so we're assuming we're blocking off the flip base, what other types of antimicrobials or antifungals can we now see increased activity with? So I'll end there. I'll just give a shout out to my lab. Obviously, any lab can do great work, but a great lab to do that great work needs great people. So here's our lab here. We were fortunate enough to go to the ACS spring meeting where Rob was able to present some of his awesome results. That's Rob's project. I'll also give a quick shout out to Akila, who is in my lab, who's also a graduate student. She's doing some work looking at physical chemical interactions with some peptides. And Christina, who also should be graduating, whose work I didn't present today, but she's been looking at some light activated peptides for antimicrobial activity. And our collaborators at Rutgers, collaborators at NJIT, interdisciplinary collaborators here at Seton Hall. Brian Nichols has really helped me out a lot with some related projects and some funding. We had a, based off of the initial URC grant, we had some work we were doing with actually an alumni startup company called Never Germs, and still hoping that the R01 grant comes through. The program officer has been saying that there have been delays, but they're confident that it will come through. So I will hopefully have good news to let people know about an R01 grant that will support this work in the future as well. So thank you all very much for listening. And thank you again, Dr. Buschman, for the invitation, and everyone for your time.
Thank you, Greg. You're not the only one hoping for an R01 grant.
I know.
All right, our next speaker is Richard Fritzke. Richard is an adjunct faculty member in the core. He has an MA in American Civilization from Seton Hall and has recently published a book on the insight and inspiration of Abraham Lincoln by Hamilton Books, which is a division of Rowman and Littlefield, which is itself, I think, a division or affiliated with a couple of other publishers. Rich is going to speak on probing the minds and hearts of those who never stop probing the soul and ends of Abraham. Take it away, Rich. You're muted. You need to unmute. Still muted.
I'm the one who caused you to say what you didn't want to say. I apologize for that. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be with so many great minds and great people this morning, and I appreciate being a part of this. The inspiration for what I did was born at the apex of the Trump administration. There are so many articles appearing in so many different news outlets about comparisons between Abraham and Lincoln and Donald Trump, which to me were absolutely non-existent. They were as extremely different as it is possible for two people to be, i.e. Lincoln, the humblest of presidents, and Trump, who looked upon himself as the grandest and greatest of presidents. So that's what drove me into this project. I reached out to Lincolnites everywhere, and I wound up getting a perfect 45 participants who simply responded to 5 simple questions that drove me in all kinds of different directions. And I think in the end produced something of value. You know, Lincoln, there are more than 17,000 published works on Abraham Lincoln. Next to the Lord God Almighty, he's been written about as much as anyone ever has. So why this book? Well, why this book was to, I guess you'd say, Trump wasn't tethered when he became president. Trump had no sense of history, no appreciation of history. He didn't even know when the Civil War was fought. He knew very little of history, had no appreciation for the American story, the how, what, and why of our country. And so, too, he wasn't tethered to God either. He wasn't tethered to faith either. He pretended to be, but he was not. And so that's why he was a very loose cannon, if you will. And I thought it was important to go to Abraham Lincoln in a moment like that, to go to Abraham Lincoln, who, in as rich a way as possible, tells us what the American national soul is, what we wanted to be about from the beginning and still are in the process of becoming. So long and short, I had wonderful people, great Lincoln historians, all walks of Lincoln life, if you will. I was blessed. My 5 simple questions, the first was simply, what brought them to Lincoln? You know, was it a book, an event, a teacher, a prof, a trip when they were a child? What drew them so intensely to Lincoln? The second was, what character trait, value, or quality forever sealed the deal? There were a spot-on 45 responses to that particular question. Only I gave a single answer as asked. I asked them for the one character trait, but they weren't single lens Lincolnites. They were multi-lens Lincolnites. So I got multiple answers from just about everyone. As many as 8 referenced humility, compassion, and empathy. Top of the chart. That was followed by kindness, humanity, generosity, courage, faith, determination, humor, resiliency. My single response was magnanimity. Interestingly, for Honest Abe, only one of the 45 mentioned honesty as a character trait that drew them to Lincoln. I opined in my book that it might become a much more appreciated value again after the 45th president's more than 33,000 verified lies. The third question was, what conversation would they most have liked to have had with him, and why? The responses were phenomenal. They were all over the place. They focused on the war, the carnage, the suffering, military strategy, slavery, emancipation, 13th Amendment, Reconstruction, individual battles, individual generals, his relationship with them, to be with him in cabinet meetings and aboard the River Queen at the peace conference, at Antietam with him, walking in Richmond with him on that glorious day. In Secretary Seward's parlor, I spent a good deal of time focusing upon the relationship between Lincoln and Seward. Seward was Lincoln's safe harbor. He loved to go to Seward's at night. He didn't like the fancy meals. He didn't go for the dinners. He didn't like the cigars. He never drank, so he didn't go for the brandy. He went for the company, and he went for the laughter, which Seward brought to him in spades. There were so many other places that they went, and I'm going to just brush through that. The fourth question was what words written or spoken by Lincoln meant the most to them, spoke the loudest to them, and why. The fifth question was, how do we best tap Lincoln in our own day to heal the great divide in America in our own time? Responses to that were oblique. Everybody wished. They did a lot more wishing than they did examining. Just a few points of interest, things that I discovered in this investigation. Did you know that Lincoln's three closest friends were all Billies? Billy Herndon, his long partner. But I became convinced that a New Salem barber, Billy de Flourville, who traipsed off to Springfield with Lincoln as well and set up a barbershop right across from the State House where Lincoln could hang out and perform for him, if you will, bring the crowds in and make them laugh. Billy de Flourville was the one he left his home in care of when he left Springfield, his horse and his dog. Billy de Flourville mattered. He sent this incredible letter to Lincoln later on in his presidency. Just this loving letter. And then the third was Billy Slade, who was his body man in Washington. Billy Slade knew all of his secrets, knew what he was going to do before anyone else in the command structure did. Billy Slade, was very, very important to him. Two of those men were African American, and that spoke loudly to me. And neither of them, after more than 17,000 books on Lincoln, have been explored enough. That's a place for historians to dip their hearts and their hands into. Elizabeth Keckley was important to him, had tremendous impact upon him, and she was his wife, Mary Seamstress. And then, of course, the 180,000 African-American soldiers. So while Lincoln forever for their freedom, forever passionately for their freedom, he had, like most whites in Illinois, doubts as to whether or not African Americans were the equal of Caucasian whites. That was finally subdued in the White House years. That was put asunder. Lincoln learned everything he needed to know finally, and yes, indeed, they did. It was fully resolved, subdued in the White House. Did you know, this was another interesting thing I dove into, that his mother and his stepmom were together on the second day of his life, and that the conversation was extraordinary. That was, of course, at Knob Creek in Hogganville, Kentucky. And they quite literally referred to this 2-day-old child sleeping on a bearskin rug beside them by the fire was to be a daredevil. He was to be courageous. They knew he was going to be brave. They knew he was going to be a leader. His mother called him a difference maker. They said he would be kind and gentle. And his mother said, he's going to have tremendous courage. After all, Daniel Boone's blood runs in my son's veins. I paid a great deal of attention to Lincoln's lifelong shadowboxing with God. His intimate knowledge of Scripture, that chapter and verse, Lincoln knew the Bible. In fact, anything Lincoln read, he retained. He had that extraordinary capacity. As a child, as a child. He'd regurgitate the hellfire and damnation sermon that was just given by some Baptist minister on a rock promontory in the forest for his friends. And he'd do it in humorous fashion. I believe Lincoln could have been the greatest comic of his age and of his time. He made them laugh all of his life. But his life was shadowed by loss, despair, doubt. Death shadowed him. There was always that question of why he never belonged to a church. In his congressional campaign in '46, that became a big issue. There are flyers as to his agnosticism. And of course, you could not be that and be elected. At least that was the thought. He ran against a Reverend Cartwright. And at one point in the summer before the election, Lincoln visited one of his tent meetings, and he sat on a bunch of logs at the edge, the back, if you will, the back of this tent gathering. And when the Reverend Cartwright got into his calling people up to be healed and to receive the Spirit, etc., Lincoln quietly tried to get up to take his leave. And the Reverend Cartwright made a show of it. Why, Mr. Lincoln, where are you going? Where are you going, sir? Just as he's calling people up to be saved. And Lincoln just softly says, but very distinctly and clearly says, why, Reverend Cartwright, my friend, I am going to the Congress of these United States of America. Great response. I go to a long line of witnesses to his faith. His best friends, besides the three I've already mentioned, were ministers. He was close to ministers his entire life. And there were those famous incidents in the White House with the Quakers, particularly. I am convinced that the two meetings that he had in the White House, among the thousands that he had, that gave him peace, that gave him comfort, were his sessions with Elizabeth Gurney and Elizabeth Comstock, two Quakers from Pennsylvania. In that he made the war. Lincoln long believed himself responsible to both ancestry and to posterity and to God for all of the death and the suffering. That was right out of the old Episcopal confessional prayer book. And so he became the White House's night walker as he dead of night. Who do you think will win this war?
I believe he's frozen.
Do I still have time to go on?
You have a little time left. You were frozen there for just a moment.
Okay, he prevailed in the end, I truly believe, because he was one with the night, where he subdued his life from depression, what he called the hypo. He had the night to spend with Artemus Ward and Petroleum V. Nasby, and his days were rough and busy. And it was during the night where he found the time to think, to determine, to strategize, that they denied him. Everyone can see how Lincoln aged over those 4 years. I'm going to conclude with a piece right out of my book, and hopefully within the time constraints. I wrote at one point, the arguments at the core of the Civil War have remained with us ever since. We still debate the division of power between the federal government and the states. The political discussion over jobs continues to pit those who seek to free up capital, resulting in more employment, against those who seek safeguards that guarantee a living wage, access to health care, equality of opportunity, and safe working conditions. We no longer countenance slavery, but racism is rampant, and while equality is a well-defended principle of our national creed, it is subject to the clash between those who would preserve only equality of opportunity and those who demand equality of results. These are healthy arguments, well within the bounds of reasonable discourse, and Lincoln might well have seen such debate as the sign of a durable republic. But the most disturbing echo of the past comes in the threat to union, in the decline of civility, and in the drawing of rigid lines between political factions. That would surely have saddened Lincoln beyond measure. As to that fifth question I asked as to how Lincoln can serve, we need Lincoln. We need people to go to Lincoln today. We need people to get in touch with American history, including their bogus arguments about critical race theory, which is just a nice term to make it sound something different than it is. The pure, unadulterated history of the United States of America, our story. We're forgetting our stories. We're forgetting our past. And that's at issue. And that's, it's into that venue that my efforts and my research, that my work with 45 wonderful Lincolnites who taught me so much, that's where it brought me. There's a whole lot more, but thank you for listening. I so very much appreciate being a part of this. I'm learning a lot and appreciate it.
Thank you, Rich. I'm now going to turn over moderating duties to my colleague, Michael LaFountaine, who is professor in physical therapy and for purposes here, director of the Office of Grants and Research Services. And we're still, I guess, new colleagues, aren't we, Mike?
Depends on who you talk to.
All right. You can introduce Dr. Mayhew.
I will do that. And so again, thank you for handing the baton. And again, thank you for everyone who is participating in this venue. All the participants viewing, watching, and everything else. It's really a great way to, learn more about our colleagues and to hear about their interest and their passion. So up next, we have Dr. Robert Mayhew, who is going to be speaking on friendship in Aristotle's Eudemian ethics. Dr. Mayhew is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, where his primary research interests entail ancient philosophy. He has his doctoral degree from Georgetown University. And if he's glowing or smiling, it's just because he returned from the south of France recently, where he participated in an international conference on the Aristotelian Mirabilia. So Dr. Mayhew, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here. I'm glad I was able to get back in time and get over jet lag. All right, so let me just get started. Aristotle wrote two major works presenting his moral philosophy, the Nicomachean Ethics and the Eudemian Ethics. And these titles, by the way, are likely the modern or the ancient equivalent of what nowadays would be a dedication. Nicomachus was the name of both his father and his son, and Eudemus was the name of one of his colleagues in the Lyceum. Now, there's a great deal of controversy over why any philosopher would write two major works on the same subject and what the relationship between these two works are. Is the difference one of chronology, or is it a question of each work having a different audience? There's disagreement over which work was written first, and some argue that the Eudemian Ethics is aimed more at straight philosophers, whereas the Nicomachean Ethics is aimed more at people who plan on participating in, who are in the Lyceum but are planning on participating in politics in the running of the city. I don't think there's been a scholarly consensus on either of those issues. A lot is up in the air. Right or wrong, however, the Nicomachean Ethics has long been considered the better, more mature of the two works, and so has received a far greater scholarly attention than the Eudemian Ethics. But this has changed in recent years as ever more scholars of ancient Greek ethics are focusing on the latter work. A little over a year ago, I was offered a contract by Harvard University Press to produce a new edition of the Eudemian Ethics for the prestigious Loeb Classical Library. And Loeb's look like this. You have Greek or Latin on one side and the English translation and et cetera. So I received a URC stipend to devote the summer of 2021 to preparing the 7th and longest book of the Eudemian Ethics, book 7. Now, a book in this context represents what was originally one papyrus scroll. The subject of Eudemian Ethics, book 7, is friendship. The Greek word is philia, which is actually broader than our term friendship, as it refers, as Aristotle defines it, to any relationship involving mutual feelings of goodwill where both parties are aware of each other and those feelings. Right? In fact, sometimes our word affection better captures what philia refers to. Now, Aristotle discusses the nature and kinds of friendship, the role it plays in the virtuous life, and its contribution to happiness. Preparing this new low volume of the Eudemian Ethics involves creating a decent Greek text with notes indicating what I regard as the necessary emendations and conjectures, and producing a new English translation with explanatory notes aimed particularly at non-specialists. Now, this was my 6th summer stipend, and never have I so grossly miscalculated how much I would be able to achieve in the time I had. Now, each book of the Eudemian Ethics is divided into chapters and each chapter into paragraphs. And unlike the different books, these chapters and paragraph divisions are a modern invention. But in any event, I follow the paragraphs as they're found in the Oxford Classical Text, which is my base text. So what I do is I proceed paragraph by paragraph. I begin by reading the Greek text, identifying cruxes, and making note of the manuscript variants and any scholarly emendations and conjectures. A crux is a word or passage in the manuscripts that scholars consider corrupt or otherwise difficult or impossible to make sense of, or where there are significant variant readings in the manuscripts. So, for example, Aristotle says at one point that a friend wishes to be, quote, as the saying says, another Heracles, another this, unquote. Now, the problematic Greek is hutos, which is this or this person, but it's been suggested that by changing one letter, you can turn hutos into autos, and then the text says that a friend wishes to be, quote, as the saying says, another Heracles, another self, unquote. Most editors adopt this conjecture, but I'm not so sure that this is such an improvement. I mean, yes, Aristotle seems to say elsewhere that a friend is another self, but what is that doing in connection with Heracles here? I just don't know. So the point is that you can only get so far tampering with the text. There's going to be, interpretive questions that remain. Anyway, in each case, I provisionally decide what to print in my Greek text and what to write in the textual notes. And this is quite difficult and time-consuming, as the manuscripts that have come down to us of this work particularly, they're in terrible shape. As one scholar put it, quote, the text of the Eudemian Ethics is in a vile state, hideous corruption on every page, unquote. I next make a provisional, after I've covered the Greek text and notes for one paragraph, I then make a provisional translation of the paragraph I'm working on, and then I compare it to the other English translations of this work, every one of which I am more or less critical of. If any of those have something radically different from mine, I go back and double check to see if I missed something or otherwise made a mistake, or whether I simply have a very different view of how to construe the Greek. Then I move on to the next paragraph, and I continue in this way until I finish, until a draft of the entire book is finished. Now, that's how I've proceeded in general. But as it turns out, the text of Book 7 proved to be in even worse shape than the previous books. So my pace was even slower, and I spent much more time than expected reading a lot of the secondary literature on the text of the Eudemian Ethics, Book 7, such that by the end of the stipend period, I had prepared a draft of the Greek text with translation and notes of Book 7, chapters 1 through 10, and it took me another month or a little bit more after the semester got going and I'd settled into my classes, to finish the 2 remaining chapters, the last chapter being a particularly long and difficult one. Now, let me say something about the content of Eudemian Ethics 7, which you might find more interesting than the stuff about the texts and the manuscripts. Now, Aristotle, like Socrates and Plato before him, and arguably like the Stoics after him, he defended a version of what's called eudaimonism. This stems from the Greek word eudaimonia, which is usually translated happiness, though perhaps flourishing or human flourishing or the good life better conveys the sense of the word. According to eudaimonism, in a nutshell, 1, the purpose of a person's life is eudaimonia, is achieving the good life. And 2, possessing the virtues is how one achieves this. Or perhaps it's more accurate to say the virtues are essential constituents of the good life. Now, for Socrates and the Stoics, and arguably for Plato in some of his dialogues, virtue is the necessary and sufficient condition of happiness. If you are virtuous, you are living the good life, no matter what else is happening to you. But Aristotle rejected this. He agreed that happiness, the good life, was impossible without virtue. It is a necessary condition. But he also thought that virtue was not a sufficient condition for happiness. We also need what he calls goods of the body, for example, a certain degree of health, and also external goods. And by external goods, he means a certain level of wealth. He did not think living in abject poverty was consistent with living the good life, whereas some, philosophers thought that was, Socrates thought you could achieve that. But the most important external goods he thought were friends, philoi, right? Other people for whom you feel affection and who in some way share in your life. Friendship is so important in his conception of eudaimonism that he devoted 2 books to friendship in the Nicomachean Ethics and 1 book in the Eudemian Ethics. And as he writes in the Eudemian Ethics, quote, "We assume that a friend is among the greatest of goods, and that friendlessness and isolation are quite terrible, because the whole of life and voluntary association are with them. For we spend our days with our household, or relatives, or companions, or children, or parents, or wife," unquote. Now, this should also give you a good idea of how much broader the Greek term philia is than our word friendship. In fact, companion being the closest in this list to our sense of friend. Now, Eudemian Ethics, Book 7, opens with this mouthful of a sentence, which I'm considering dividing into 2 easier to swallow sentences. But in any event, here's the more unmanageable one. But this matches the Greek. Quote, "Concerning friendship, what it is and what qualities it has, and who is a friend, and whether friendship is said in one way or in many ways, or if in many ways, how many, and further, how one ought to treat a friend and what justice is in the context of friendship, these must be investigated no less than what are noble and choice-worthy in connection with character traits, that is, in connection with the virtues," unquote. Now, Aristotle goes on to describe 3 kinds of friendship: friendship of utility, friendship of pleasure, and the most important kind, character friendship. This last is, he says, the paradigmatic form of friendship. And it's also the rarest in the sense that it describes what are usually one's very close friends. In most cases, he says, a person has 1 or 2 best friends of this sort. So you could think of one soulmate, in effect. What connects these friends are their characters, their virtues and personality, we might say, and in what activities they wish to spend their lives. There's much more I could say about this fascinating text, but I think I want to follow the fine tradition of these earlier talks and finish under time. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Robert, for that very interesting talk. You stole my thunder. I was getting ready to send you a 3-minute warning. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for the talk. Our next speaker will be Dr. Victor Velarde-Mayol, who will be speaking about the physics of time. Dr. Velarde Mayol is an associate professor of philosophical theology. He holds a doctoral degree from the University of Madrid and has varied research interests, including the specialization of metaphysics, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, Thomism, philosophy of the mind, including epistemology, and phenomenology. Dr. Velarde Mayol, the floor is yours. Assuming he is here.
He's actually not in the room with us at the moment.
All right. So then I will save that introduction. Is Dr. Cottrell in the room at this point? I think because we're ahead of schedule, everyone is trying to time their insertion point.
Dr. Cottrell is not with us at this moment either.
All right. How about Dr. Timmer?
I'm here.
Oh, perfect. So Dr. Jennifer Timmer is going to be speaking on the topic called Hired to Fail, Examining Glass Cliffs in Education. Dr. Timmer is an assistant professor, in the Education Leadership Management and Policy Department. She holds a doctoral degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and her research interests include representation, access, and compensation in the principalship and superintendency, and how quantitative methods can help advance equity in education. Dr. Timmer, the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully. Okay, can we see my slides now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. I want to, second what several other colleagues have said today. This has been really a fascinating day thus far, learning about everybody's research interests and such. And so I'm excited to talk about some ongoing work that I've been doing, looking at glass cliffs in education leadership. I can advance my slides. Okay. So there are kind of two main components that I'm going to be talking about today. So the first is thinking about this idea of looking at women in education leadership and what's known as the glass cliff phenomenon. And then you'll see that kind of alongside with this research, there are a lot of data limitations in education research and trying to do this kind of work. And so there's some relevant implications for that as well. And so specifically for this project, I'm going to be talking about the creation of a statewide longitudinal administrative data set that I've been working on for the state of New Jersey, and then some preliminary findings using that data set regarding the representation of women superintendents here in the state. So when we look at the representation of women educators in K-12 schools in the US, we see that on average, about 80% or so of our teachers tend to be women. A little more than half of our principals are women, and then somewhere between 20 to 25% of our superintendents are women. And in New Jersey, we see that it looks fairly similar in that women tend to hold about, again, 79–80% of teaching positions, maybe slightly higher than the national average in terms of the proportion of superintendents who are women. But what we see kind of throughout all of this is that estimates really differ in terms of these numbers, depending on what kinds of sources you might be using. And so there are a number of large surveys that are often used and cited. Those surveys, though, sometimes, not just sometimes, they almost always suffer from very low response rates. And when I say low, I mean actually like 12–13% response rates. And so, very useful in some manners, but of course that's not going to be representative in a more large scale sense. And so some other ways that we get this data tends to be from looking at some of the largest districts in the country, which again is informative, but is going to be excluding a lot of the districts serving a lot of our students. So the data tends to be best looking at teachers, and then again, we're much more limited when we look at both principals and superintendents and other kinds of leaders within the larger education hierarchy.
So I'm going to kind of continue to come back, like I said before, to this kind of question about the limitations of the data. But the takeaway here really from this slide is that we see that we have fewer women in education leadership positions, both when we compare them to the teacher workforce and to their students in the communities that they're serving. So there has been a fair amount of research looking at kind of why is it that we see fewer women in these leadership positions. People have looked at things, maybe there's just a lack of interest, maybe women aren't qualified at the same rates, maybe women are less inclined to take these positions due to caregiving responsibilities, maybe there's bias in hiring. I've done some work looking in some of these areas, and again, there's a lot of interesting work out there, kind of trying to determine what it is that's happening that's making it so that we have so few women in these leadership positions, and so whereas we have so many in the teaching field. So specifically here, what I'm going to be looking at is thinking about what do we think about those? What do we know about those who do obtain these leadership positions, and what do those positions look like? And so it may be that when there are positions available, that it might be that these positions actually are more challenging, and that these women educators are not set up for success in kind of the same way as their colleagues. And so when women are hired into leadership positions, these positions are often characterized as more precarious than the positions of their male counterparts. This kind of work has been looked at a fair amount in the business world. And so we see that women tend to be hired as CEOs right when companies are on the verge of bankruptcy. And so it's not that it was actually the actions of that woman leader that put the company in that position, but then the woman is at the helm when the company goes through that process. And so then the woman leader is actually the person kind of labeled as the person in charge when the company actually was failing and going under. And so when we look at women leaders in education, we tend to see that women often lead in schools and districts that are kind of considered to have higher needs, kind of almost in any way that you might want to define that. So we can think about that in terms of funding, so schools that are receiving less funding than other schools, looking at community demographics in terms of the income base, for example, of the community, looking at academic achievement. So they often are serving in schools that on average have lower academic achievement scores. And in terms of student demographics, we see that women are often leading schools and districts where we have higher proportions of students who have disabilities, or who are English learners, or who are coming from lower income families. And so but again, we kind of have some suggestion of this, but this is kind of a new area of research, and because of, again, some of the data limitations, this has not really been looked at in education. So the three main research questions that I'm going to be focusing on today in terms of our preliminary findings are thinking about, first of all, do male and female superintendents differ in their qualifications and experience? Secondly, to what extent are female superintendents serving different district communities from their male colleagues? And lastly, then, does district achievement on average differ by superintendent sex, controlling for some of the different leader and district characteristics that we can identify? But first, we're going to jump back into the data and kind of think about the data set that I'm working on creating. So like I mentioned before, at this point, we really have very limited administrative data in education. It's very common that we have student data, and this is mostly in large part due to major federal policy requirements, such as No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, other kinds of federal and state regulations that require the public reporting of this data. It's considered public information, as these are public schools. This is taxpayer funded work. And so so it's quite common that a fair amount of student data is available. And if you think about parents may look at, for example, school report cards when they're deciding where to send their children or where to buy a home. And so that kind of data is often available and publicly available. However, it does kind of just still depend on your location. So different states are going to have different requirements in terms of what they actually publish. Some states are going to make kind of everything available to anybody who wants it. Some states are going to make data available really more only to researchers, and then again, kind of the format, the amount of data. Sometimes you can see, again, like a school report card. Sometimes they actually will have full school level information available for download for anybody who wants it. And that actually happens to be the case in New Jersey. Now, administrative data, it's much less common that it's going to be available, and the availability is even more dependent on the location. And so the local reporting requirements and regulations are going to be much different because there's less of the federal oversight on some of these kinds of pieces of information. And so again, you're going to have a lot of variability in terms of what's kind of available. It's quite common that that there will be partnerships with universities and local state boards, education departments and such. But really what happens is that this really leads to education and research being dominated by certain data sets. So there are certain large school districts or certain states that tend to make their data more widely available. And so that's where we get a lot of our information. That's where we do a lot of our research. So I really see this as an opportunity to develop New Jersey data to inform policy both within the state and more broadly in the research community. So why New Jersey? I mean, other than the fact that we're here. So New Jersey is consistently ranked as one of the top K-12 public education systems in the country, depending on kind of who you look at, but they're always right up there at the top. It's also a really unique location because it's such a diverse state in terms of student demographics. We have both urban and rural locations and everything in between. And while it's very diverse, we also see a fair amount of segregation. So there's a lot of variability across schools and districts in terms of the students and who their leaders are serving. We have a large number of school districts, and as of 2018, which is the year that I'm going to be focusing on, about 35% of the superintendents in this state were women, which again is higher than the national average. And so that gives us kind of a little bit of a unique perspective on thinking about leadership in public schools in the U.S. So I've been working on creating this statewide longitudinal data set, and so we have 10 years of data, and this is it's compiled from multiple different data sets. So again, New Jersey makes publicly available a lot of their data. It's in a lot of different formats on a lot of different places on their website, but it's there, and you can also request kind of a nicer formatted version, which is what I did. But while it's interesting, they give you a lot of the administrative information, a lot of the personnel data. They actually don't provide sex or race, ethnicity for the employees that are included in the data set. So we have all public school educators. We have all kinds of information about where they're working, their salary, but there is no sex or race ethnicity, which means that part of my task has been to determine the sex for each of the educators, each of the superintendents in the data set. So I've been following some work that White in 2022 published looking at this. A lot of these are, because I have their names, it's very easy. John, Robert versus a Jennifer, for example, or a Sarah. And then for any name like a Terry or a Lee or something that might be more ambiguous, I actually just look them up. And so we have about 500 superintendents across the state. And so that's been a big piece of that task. And then I'm combining this data with data from the Stanford Educational Data Archive, which is CEDA, which is really unique, interesting new data set that's come out that's really focusing on opportunity gaps. And so this is going to be able to give us a sense of if our women and men leaders are again, serving similar communities or not. And then this is also paired with Common Core of data information. So in terms of some of these preliminary findings, we find that that New Jersey superintendents are similarly qualified regardless of sex in terms of their years of experience and the proportion of them that have a doctoral degree. The vast majority of the remaining have a master's degree. And so, but we do see that male superintendents are more highly paid on average. It's not statistically significant, though I would argue that about $5,000 is practically significant. We also find that male and female superintendents are actually serving fairly similar districts in the state, more so than we often find in looking in other places. And so we see that they're serving districts with similar achievement. Women are serving districts that have more students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch, and they're also serving districts that have more non-white students. And so those tend to be markers of districts that have more high needs in terms of the educational supports that they will be needing. And when we look to try to kind of control and think about does district average achievement differ by superintendent sex, thinking about controlling for some of these other characteristics, we find that there's that really the districts have pretty similar achievement on average, regardless of superintendent sex, when we control for these different covariates. Though there is some suggestion that districts with women leaders have slightly higher achievement, especially in English and language arts. And we find, unsurprisingly, that student demographics are related to outcomes, kind of regardless of leader characteristics. So what we find here is that in New Jersey, our superintendents are highly qualified, and male and female superintendents tend to be equally qualified on average. And though we do see women with a slightly more experience, slightly higher percentage of them having doctoral degrees, and even though that's the case, we also see that they tend to be paid slightly less. And so again, we also see that male and female superintendents are working in somewhat similar districts, though women are more likely to lead districts with those greater student need in those manners. And then we also see that male and female superintendents tend to have those similar outcomes given their district demographics. And so there's some suggestion again that women have slightly better ELA achievement, which is particularly notable given kind of the working in these more challenging settings. So as I continue to work on this, again, this was really just focusing on 1 year, but I've been working on putting this together for the 10 years. So that kind of longitudinal expansion, and then that's going to allow kind of more continued analyses, bringing in kind of some of these other areas in terms of funding and staffing levels and such. And also then to be able to look really at pre and post hire trends. And I'm also working with some colleagues. There might be some opportunities to try to do some comparisons with some other states. And so just in general, this is ongoing work that I'm really excited about. And I want to also just give a shout out and a thank you to the University Research Council, whose funding has made this work possible. Thanks so much.
So thank you, Dr. Timmer, for that very interesting presentation. Best of luck with your work going forward, especially as you are working on a topic where there is somewhat ambiguous and sometimes missing data points. So kudos to you and good luck going forward. So we will now kind of jump off schedule a little bit again and bring forward Dr. Jessica Cottrell, who is an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences. Her talk will be entitled Investigations of Bone Metabolism Using 3D Bone Organoid Model. Dr. Cottrell holds her doctoral degree from the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey, and her research interests focus on understanding the mechanisms guiding early stage bone metabolism. Dr. Cottrell, you have the floor.
Okay. Okay, am I supposed to share my screen? I'm just not is that how it's working?
Yeah, yes, you can share if you need to.
All right, am I sharing the right screen?
Yep, and we can see your slides.
You're good.
Okay, great. Hold on, I can't see my own slides. Okay. All right, so thank you guys for having me. I'm just going to talk about a subset of the research that we're currently doing in my lab. And I'll start off with giving you a little background in regards to why I do bone homeostatic and bone fracture research, mainly because the cost to society is large, right? So estimated in 2019, it tends to cause about $95 billion worth of hospital costs, and then people out of work and those kind of things, another $127 billion. So it costs healthcare a lot of money to have things broken and try to heal them. Bone homeostasis itself is a process by which bone building cells known as osteoblasts and bone resorbing cells known as osteoclasts maintain the BMD, or the bone mineral density, of our bones in response to environmental cues such as hormones or injury. And when bone homeostasis is dysregulated, it leads to a loss of bone mineral density, which then increases your fracture risk. Conditions like diabetes or osteoporosis are common examples of how hormones, bone homeostasis, and injury can be interrelated. Up here in the corner, I have just a picture of a normal healthy bone that has the trabecular bone equally distributed throughout it. However, when you have something like osteoporosis, the trabecular bone is decreased, and then the organization of that bone is then kind of scrambled or dysregulated. What that does is, as you have more space, it causes any fall risk or any type of injury to result in a fracture a bit easier. And so as a result of that, it's an important place to kind of study why we go from this to this over time and what we can do to prevent that. And then in diabetes, because of insulin and glucose dysregulation, it has a negative effect on people with diabetes being able to heal their bones. And so what ends up happening is they end up having a hole in their bone or a fracture that tends to become a chronic injury site. And or if it does heal, it heals poorly, and then it can cause injury in the future. So what is bone homeostasis or bone metabolism? These two words are kind of interchangeable. So here's just kind of a brief schematic of the main stages. So most of the time, our bone can be what we call quiescent, not going through a homeostatic or a metabolic process, but really all of our bones go through this process over a blanket amount of time, and all your bones are kind of replenished over time. But when a hormone or something cues activation of bone homeostasis, what happens is the osteoclasts will come to that site, so they're here in blue, and through signaling with these osteocytes, which are embedded osteoblasts, it activates this area to undergo active resorption, so that we see here. So these osteoblasts mature, they become mature, osteoclasts mature, they become mature osteoclasts, and they start eating the bone and removing the bone in this area. At the same time, other cells are recruited to the site, such as osteoblasts, which are the bone builders, a lot of immune cells, such as macrophages, T cells, B cells, and together they undergo this resorption process. As resorption comes to an end through certain signals, then osteoblasts will take over here in these little green rectangles. And those green rectangles will basically make osteoid. Osteoid is a scaffold, or the first deposition of bone. And then over time, after the bone is fully formed in this area, a process of what we call mineralization will happen. We'll take this kind of naive osteoid and make it into a more dense, stronger mineralized bone that you can see here. And so our body kind of cycles through this process over time. If you are a patient that has something like multiple myeloma, a bone cancer, or it's a cancer of the blood that affects the bone, your bone homeostatic process is dysregulated because the cancer cells there, they discouple this process, and they lead to an increase in osteoclast resorption and lead to the presence of things like these osteolytic lesions. Research lab, about a couple years ago, we began working on development of this 3D organoid to study the bone in the lab, because there's not a real easy in vivo model. And my PhD student, who is now graduated, Rich Visconti, developed a human version of this model, which also had a disease version that was, in fact, a replica of what we just saw, multiple myeloma. And my current student, James Fuller, he's worked over the last couple of years to make a similar model, but just using mouse-derived lines. The advantage of this is just there's a lot of data out there on mice and a lot of tools that we can use for mouse-related work, and the cost is much more reasonable. So first, I'm just going to show you how what the organoid is and how we developed it, because this was a big part of these projects. So on day one, what happens is we add Matrigel, and Matrigel is just a scaffold that contains things like collagen and laminin and all these different things necessary to build bone. We add osteoblasts to this cell, or to this Matrigel droplet, and we allow the bone to grow for about 21 days, 3 weeks. within 3 weeks, we get a nice ossified bone area. On that 3-week time point, we will then add osteoclasts to the culture. And then we give those osteoclasts time to mature and become one kind of with that the bone that has developed at the bottom of the culture. And so usually between days 30 and 34, we have bone that's in that homeostatic function that we are trying to recapitulate that happens in our normal bones. After that, we can do various things to test, like how, exposure to a trace element affects bone homeostasis, or how does the exposure to T cell change the process of bone homeostasis. And so this is where we do a lot of our work trying to understand the different things that can affect the bone homeostatic functions. On this figure, I'm just showing you kind of one of the first things we wanted to verify was what we were actually growing was actually bone and not just calcium or hydroxyapatite at the bottom of the well. And so here is a FTIR analysis, which is like a spectral analysis of what the bone is. This we did in conjugation with chemistry. Kaz helped us complete this work. And you can see here's the spectra of our 3D organoid bone. And you can see down here that it's very similar to human bone and not a little similar to hydroxyapatite because that's part of bone, but not just hydroxyapatite. So that was great because this showed us that that 3D organoid was actually the chemical components of bone put together in the same structure. Over here on the right, we did micro CT to demonstrate the structure in a 3D version. And over here on this slide here, you can see kind of the development. Here is the slide, and here is the 3D bone nodule. And you can see in the micro CT image that you can see lots of calcium in bone. And then, of course, we did a histological analysis that shows kind of the infrastructure of that as well. On the right is the disease bone that we had created with multiple myeloma. And you can see here with the multiple myeloma bone that there's very little white material that's compacted, and that even when we do the histological version of that, it's all deteriorating. On this slide, we show again just some more characterization that we did of the bone model to make sure that it was acting like a bone in homeostatic balance. And here at A, we are basically measuring the output of the osteoblast in the normal bone. So 3D NB is the normal bone, and we can see that the osteoblast output is high. If we disease or we cause a disease in it like multiple myeloma, it's low. Over here, B and C are measures of osteoclast function, which should be relatively low in a homeostatic model. And you can see in both cases, the osteoclast function is reasonably muted. But if we add multiple myeloma or a disease model, we can see we can accelerate that osteoclast activity. And so we have a basic shift, right? So when it's disease, we have an increase of osteoclast activity that's shown in red and a decrease of bone activity by those osteoblasts. When we look at them under a microscope, you can see here that the normal model is nice and dense. You can barely see through it because it's all bone. But here in the disease model, you can start to see it becomes a little bit more transparent, showing that we're reducing the bone and that the bone's going somewhere. And then this is just a visual of the gene expression that is going on in the 3D bone model. And here in this column, it just shows you that the 3D bone model is expressing genes associated with bone as we would expect them to be. But then when we add a disease such as multiple myeloma, we kind of reduce the expression of those common bone markers. So development of these organoids has taken quite a while, but we were able to characterize and show that we can develop a osteoblast-derived bone fragment or model that demonstrates osteoclast-mediated resorption. And it's pretty much fully functional and compares and mimics what we see in the bone remodeling process. And at the same time, we were able to create a disease state through incorporation of the multiple myeloma cancer cell line. And we published a lot of this work this past summer. So as we developed the mouse model, we started thinking about different ways that we could use the model in the lab. And so when I applied for the URC grant, what I proposed was doing things in different fields. And so most of them fall under these blankets, either bone physiology, cancer therapeutics, and immunology. And so I'm going to quickly go through a snippet of each of these projects because they're kind of they're in their infancy, and we're just starting to get data over the last, I would say, 6 months. So first project is focusing kind of on environmental contaminants. All right, so trace elements are important parts of bone homeostasis, but they also get found in water and soil because of human activities and pollution, and then they deposit there, and then vertebrates, drink water or accumulate them through different soils. And unfortunately, because bone is such a hard structure and these are trace elements, a lot of time when they get deposited in the bone, they can't get out. Right. So as a result, what we wanted to do was determine if suboptimal levels of different trace elements or trace metals had negative effects on bone homeostasis in our 3D model. And so I'm showing you a tidbit. We've done a few different models, but because of the short amount of time for this lecture, I'm just showing you our outcomes with magnesium chloride. What we see here in this graph is basically us exposing the 3D organoid model to nothing, normal, positive control, and then increasing concentrations of magnesium chloride, and then looking at osteoblast function, their ability to deposit calcium at day 7 and day 21. And you can see here that at day 7, there is a decrease in the osteoblast ability to deposit calcium. It's statistically significant. But by day 21, we see that the osteoblasts are actually able to come back from that and be able to deposit the calcium and actually start improving at the lower and medium doses when compared to the controls. And down here is just a picture of this assay, and this is no treatment. This is a positive control, and then you can see this is the low dose, medium dose, and high dose. And the more black you see, it means the higher the density of the calcium deposition. So comparing low dose to, say, the positive dose, you can see there's a much higher deposition of calcium. And so what we were able to show with this assay is that magnesium chloride has a significant dose-dependent effect on calcium deposition when compared to our controls. But now I'm going to switch gears to the cancer therapy, which is being done by a kind of combined student with biochemistry. Her name is Gina, and she's been working on this project for a while. The steps in the project and the goal of the project is basically, can we use a 3D organoid to study potential cancer therapeutics? So what Gina has done thus far is she's designed a peptide and characterized it. And then over the last few months, we've been determining whether or not that peptide can target our osteoblasts and then get internalized. So basically what this peptide does is it was designed to target osteoblasts and then get through siRNA technology, get incorporated into the cell and disrupt that cell's ability to connect that cell, that osteoblast cell, with other cells through downregulation of what we call cell adhesion molecules. And that's what's demonstrated kind of on this semi-complicated graph here. But to make it simple, we just have this layer of cells together. The idea is when the peptide engages with the cell, it gets internalized. When it internalizes, it breaks those cells apart. And so for a tumor, that would be great because then the tumor could not stick with each other as easily, and then maybe it could be exposed to other therapeutics. One of the main difficulties with targeting bone cancers is the fact that bone is so hard, like the tissue itself. So getting a lot of the therapeutic agents into or to break up the tumor can be difficult. So that's what this siRNA targeting peptide is going to do. We've had a little bit of different things where we've tried human osteoblasts, and now we're back to mouse osteoblasts so that we can use this 3D organoid model. And over here, we're just showing that our osteoblasts in our model are positive for periosteum. And we just recently had a nice picture that came in to my office a couple days ago, showed very well that the osteoblast peptide can get internalized within these cells. So our next step is to expose these 3D organoid models to the peptide siRNA conjugates, and then basically measure whether or not the siRNA is downregulating these cell adhesion proteins and whether or not that can disrupt the bone and cause it to separate from each other. So that's our upcoming goal. And lastly, one more thing where we're focused more on immunology. Basically, what this project is doing is we are studying the effects of T cell on bone homeostasis, since little data out there focuses on that. And what we want to do is determine whether or not T cells that are in the area are having effect on bone homeostasis overall. And so a pilot of this experiment is basically we took different cytokine populations that are associated with different T cell subsets, which you can see here. And we exposed the model to these different T cell subsets at high and low concentrations. And basically what we were able to show is that the T cells that are associated with Th1 and Th2, shown here, downregulate the osteoblast function, and that T cell cytokines that are associated with Th17, Th22, and T regulator cytokines appear to increase osteoblast differentiation relative control. And like I said, there's not a lot of research out there on T cells and T cells effects in bone homeostasis or really in fractures. So we're trying to just get an idea of what are they doing there normally, how do they affect homeostasis, and what things can they modulate. And so this is a pretty early project that we started about 6 months ago. So again, there's a lot of data coming out, but that's where that project is. So overall, our next steps, I kind of talked about them as I went through, but is to take the mouse 3D bone organelle model. We're wrapping up some histological and confocal microscopy studies to submit this model as a publication in the summer. And then we're going to finish up a lot of these projects that I mentioned. And I just want to give a shout out to some of my students here. The ones that are doing the trace elements will be presenting their data this May at the NJWEA conference down in Atlantic City. So they're very excited about that. And hopefully we'll get the rest of these projects kind of keep working towards their goals in the next years to come. And then finally, because I'm almost out of time, I just want to say thank you to my lab members. So here's most of them there. The data that you saw was from James Fuller, Catherine Leffrens, Pooja, and Gina today, though I have other graduate students working on different projects in the lab as well. And a shout out to Kaz again for helping with the FTIR data for the 3D organelle model. And again, a big thank you to Seton Hall University Research Council for funding this work.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Cottrell, for that very interesting and insightful talk. And as you were describing the bone research, there was just a recent grant application announcement. So you'll be getting an email from me both for larger projects and also pre and postdoc students. So here again is a wonderful chance for us to create more bridges and opportunities for our students going forward.
Hear, hear.
So it's good to have talk. This is the virtual coffee talk, the water cooler talk. So thank you again for your talk. Our next and final speaker will be Dr. Victor Velarde-Mayol, who will be speaking on the physics of time. Dr. Velarde-Mayol, is an associate professor of philosophical theology, and he holds a doctoral degree from the University of Madrid. He has varied research specializations, including metaphysics, the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas, Thomism, philosophy of the mind and epistemology, and phenomenology. So, Dr. Velarde-Mayol, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. I will try to share my screen now, just a minute. So I can, let us see, because of Teams. Okay. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, that's what I will be very brief because this is very speculative and can be very tough. And the physics of light is my theme here. And the first thing is this is just a chapter of my book, Philosophical Physics. It's probably the most difficult part of my book. I dedicate practically a whole year just to this chapter. Is very tough. I will explain first what I'm doing with the book, and then I will go directly to the physics of light. And I think it's very good to remember a classic quotation from St. Augustine that what he was asked, what is time? And nobody asked me, I know, but if I were this serious to explain it to one that should ask me, plainly, I do not know. It's very difficult to know what is time. Everybody has an internal experience of this, but it's very difficult. Well, you want to know where is my physics of time. In this book, the first chapter is dedicated to experimental physics and philosophical physics. What is the difference? I have to say that most of the first physicists in contemporary physics, like Einstein, Heisenberg, and Bohr, all of these studied philosophy very heavily, and they have an agenda, philosophical agenda. So his physics is not completely disengaged from philosophy, on the contrary. And it's very important to understand philosophical physics, to understand the limitations of mathematics, to know reality when we know that the object of mathematics only exists in the mind. And the second chapter is about the observable. What is an observable? Because this is the essence of experimental physics, only deal with observable. So I will dedicate a chapter already finished, the observable and the phenomenon and the experiment, specifically the observable. The third chapter is motion as the most basic property of materiality. And the fourth chapter is space, extension, and place, where I'm dealing with relativity of the space, the question of measuring space, and something very important is missing in experimental physics, that extension is, I would say, absolute, but space is relative. And here is the chapter 5, still working on this, is the physics of time. They have other chapters. Chapter 6 is about qualities, specifically energy. The chapter 7 is matter and substance, the question of matter. What is the difference between matter and mass and corpuscular? Remember that light is matter, corpuscular matter without mass. So this is super interesting in philosophy to analyze. And the chapter 9 is about causality, is creating a big headache in modern physics. The problem of causality at a distance, the question of gravity. The gravity is a causality at a distance or not. I have to say, because I cannot resist to say this, that Newton, who started this physics of gravity, he was not happy with the idea of gravity as a force acting at a distance. So it was difficult. It was Einstein, in my opinion, who resolved the problem. Chapter 10 is just the most philosophical, is God and contemporary physics, and how it is possible to have a notion about God in physics, and the question of the mind of the universe, very connected with the idea of God. This is probably one of the most interesting part of my book, but still is very sketchy. Well, I would like to introduce you what I'm doing now with the question of the physics of time, okay, chapter 5 of my book. Well, the first problem in physics you will see is something is paradoxical. Experimental physics is about observables. If something is not observable, it's not part of physics. Of course, there are more conditions. The observable has to be measured. If I cannot measure and to make mathematics about this, it's not interesting in physics. They will not consider this. But the problem here is that the first problem we find in experimental physics is that time is not an observable. So how it is possible to deal with time in physics when it is not an observable? It's not something you can observe experimentally. It's something you live with this, it's assumed it is there, but it's not an observable. So this is a typical issue that Einstein and Heisenberg, for me, are the most important physicists in the past, and we're very worried about this. How can be a physics of time when time is not an observable? In modern time, we distinguish between time in itself, that's what physics is doing, and the perception of time is a completely different issue. In itself, time can be considered as something real or ideal. I mean, it would be a surprise for you that many scientists consider time as something ideal, and many others as real. For example, Einstein considered time as real, is expected, but Heisenberg not. Heisenberg, but because he has a peculiar philosophy, he tried to justify with his physics. He considered time as an idea. It's not a real issue. Einstein and Newton were inclined to the reality of time. Others, more philosophers, in addition to Heisenberg, like MacTaggart, is a British philosopher educated in physics, and many other contemporary physicists consider time is ideal. It doesn't exist. Why they are saying this? Well, because everything we know about time is just the measured. It's just a rule, a measured. And measures only exist in the mind. They don't exist properly in the reality. When you measure a distance, the distance is real, but the measurement of the distance, this is something in your mind. There is no measurement if there is not a mind, okay? As perceived time, there are many philosophical schools. The most interesting, I'm talking about the perception of time here. The most interesting is phenomenology. Phenomenology probably in this moment has the most advanced theory of perception of time. Very difficult to interpret this. Why is it difficult to have an explanation of the perception of time? Well, because let us start with this. If the past doesn't exist, the future still doesn't exist, because the past existed, the future is not existing yet, only exists the present. How you perceive past, present, and future, how you perceive that? So, because you cannot perceive something that doesn't exist, you cannot perceive something is future and past. So how you can perceive something is passing from past, present, and future. And this creates a huge problem. And Husserl has a very interesting description of this that I will not explain here because it will take me many hours, is with the perception of a period of time in retention and protension. So two concepts to explain that in some way, there is a perception of a past close to the present and a perception of a future close to the present called protension, and the other is called retention. I have to say this is fascinating, but I cannot go after this. I will just sketch what I'm doing. There is two conceptions of time. One is called the topology of time. This is very typical in general relativity of Einstein, the most sophisticated theory of relativity. There is another, the special, the general relativity of time, where the time is conceived topologically. What does it mean topologically? Geometrically. Time is a line, time is geometry. But if time is a kind of geometry, something philosophers will be very uncomfortable with this, to reduce time to geometry. Geometry and time are different things, but it's very natural to do this. It's very natural to think that time can be represented by a line, but if you think that line represents time, or it is time, what kind of shape is the best representation of time? This is a problem, okay? What shape should we give to the line that represents time? This is the most common insight in relativity theory, that they conceive time as a line that can be mathematicized and put in a formula or introduced in a formula. That's the best way to deal with time in mathematics. Continuous line that extends without end in each of its two directions, okay? This will be, at this time, is very interesting and really very fructiferous in modern physics. It has an interesting moral problem. We will see in the next slide. Very interesting moral problem. Just to say this creates a moral problem. We will see. A line of time where one moves towards and backwards, because that's the problem with a line. Line doesn't have a direction. You produce the direction, but the line in itself doesn't have a direction. It can go from one extreme to the other. So it can go to the past, to the future, to the future, to the past. It's directionless, no? The whole line is presented mathematically. We know all the points. We have the true propositions, all the equations, the true propositions in each segment. So we know everything about the line. If this is the case, then we fall in what is called fatalism. There is a fatalism here. Let us see what happened here. Now I'm becoming very argumentative. I hope my argument is clear. I can explain this a little better later, but that's the spirit of philosophy. An argument of fatalism or determinism in time when time is reduced to topology or to geometry. Fatalism can be understood as the doctrine that whatever will happen in the future is already unavoidable. That's the risk I think I can find in the topology of time. Time is a geometrical line that is neutral in both directions. If we can make an argument here that is not the argument is not controversial. What is controversial is if time that notion of time, you know. There are now propositions about everything that might happen in the future because we have knowledge of all the points of the line. That's mathematically known, you know. Every proposition is either true or else false. Given 1 and 2, then there is now a set of true propositions, in this case mathematical propositions, that taken together correctly predict everything that will happen in the future. If there is now a set of true propositions that taken together correctly predict everything that will happen in the future, then whatever will happen in the future is already unavoidable. That's fatalism. This is just a formula for fatalism. There is a way to maintain a topology of time without fatalism. Well, there are people working on this, and some people say yes, other people say no. But this is a moral problem, you know. Another view of time different than the topology of time is very typical in relativity theory and in contemporary modern physics is time as flow. That's not mathematically treatable. It's not mathematically treatable or very little mathematically treatable. It can be only treated as measure the present. This concept of time is seen as a property of motion. While in Einstein, the topology of time in reality is a topological or geometrical property. It works very well in his physics. So if time here is a property of motion, not of geometry of motion, it is not something independent or something structural of our universe. It's something that belongs to a kind of activity that always every material thing have, motion. For Einstein, time is I would say the framework of the whole universe. For this vision of time as a flow is more a property of motion. So if there is no motion, there is no time. And motion is something successive. This is a very important element for the reality of time. From here, time is the flow of succession, okay? The flow of succession. From here, in reality, I don't have the time to go for this. It produced 2 types of times. Time as a measure of the motion, and the other is as the successive of the motion. But I cannot go deeper in this. So time will be the most common definition of time in this view of time as a flow, will be the measure of 2 positions in the succession of motion. This is not compatible with the vision of time in Einstein. It is not. I try to make connections, but it's really, really difficult. From here, 2 notions of time. Time is a succession of motion and time as a measure. This is completely real. But time as a measure only exists in the mind. So with this, this is the vision that probably is started with Aristotle. But now some modern physicists, and I see this in quantum mechanics, they are starting to be very close to this. So it's coming back. And with this, I finished. Thank you very much for listening to this. And for the endowment they give me to finish this difficult book for me. And I'm done with this, okay? Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you for your talk, Dr. Velarde-Mayol.
Yeah.
That wraps us up in the construct of the scheduled presenters. I'll turn the MC role back over to Dean Buschman, who will be working in Dr. Suli Chang to do some final thoughts. So Dr. Buschman.
I believe Dr. Chang has had to step away, so I will finish up by simply thanking all of our presenters. I'm noting and will note that the recording of this will be on the Research and Innovation and OGRS webpage off the Provost page. We'll be highlighting it in one of the OGRS corners in the Provost Weekly. And I want to thank Norma Rubio again for doing all of the spade work to get this program together, and my co-moderator, Mike LaFountaine. Thank you very much, everyone. It's been very interesting for me, and it really highlights the diversity and span of work that we're doing in research here at the university. Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Bye.